The ocean doesn't keep secrets, it buries them. Somewhere beneath 2 miles of crushing silence, shattered masts claw at the darkness, bronze, gold, bone, and ambition broken and forgotten. Science sends its finest machines to pluck answers from the deep. They find only better questions. Tonight, we follow 30 shipwrecks that should never have existed. Welcome to 3 hours of mysteries that refuse to drown quietly. If you love drowning in forgotten history as much as we do, go ahead, hit subscribe. We'll keep diving deeper, and the abyss always has room for more. The Dokos Shipwreck. Somewhere off the rocky coast of the Greek island of Dokos, about 20 meters below the surface, lies a riddle so old, it forgot it was a riddle. A shapeless mound of stones, a litter of shattered amphorae, no hull, no mast, no name. At first glance, you might mistake it for a pile of underwater trash. At second glance, you realize it's trash older than some gods. The Dokos shipwreck, what's left of it, dates back to around 2200 BC. In other words, this wreck was already ancient when the pyramids were young. It predates the Trojan War by centuries. It predates written history in Greece itself. In fact, it's so old that shipwreck feels like the wrong word. The more accurate term might be impossible. The 1970s weren't exactly known for underwater archaeology breakthroughs. Divers were usually too busy hunting treasure or dodging angry octopuses. But in 1975, a Greek archaeologist named Peter Throckmorton, because of course his name was Throckmorton, stumbled onto a site that immediately broke the rules of his field. No timbers remained. No ropes. Just a debris field of ceramic jars, hundreds of them scattered across the seabed like the shattered skeleton of a forgotten civilization. The amphorae were handmade, crude even, no two alike. Their design resembled the earliest pottery from the early Helladic II period, a time when the concept of seafaring trade was supposed to be about as sophisticated as tying a dead goat to a plank and hoping for favorable winds. The initial reaction from experts was charmingly simple. No way. This was Greece, after all, the land of sophisticated city-states, mighty triremes, epic heroes sailing to war. The idea that some prehistoric mariner could build a cargo vessel big enough, sturdy enough, ambitious enough to cross the Aegean Sea thousands of years before Homer's ink even dried? Absurd. Impossible. Embarrassing even. And yet, here was the evidence. Rotting quietly under 20 meters of water, daring science to tell it no. The ship itself had vanished, eaten by time and salt, and the endless, patient appetite of the ocean. But the cargo stayed. And oh, the cargo. Ceramic jars, yes, but not just any jars. Jars that matched pottery found as far away as the Cyclades, the Greek mainland, Crete. Jars suggesting an organized trade network, not just a fishing trip gone wrong. Jars implying a people who knew how to sail, how to trade, how to imagine something more than just their own craggy coastlines. And here's where it gets deliciously uncomfortable. If the Dokos wreck is what it seems to be, a cargo ship from 2200 BC, then it rewrites everything we thought we knew about early maritime history. It suggests organized seafaring, commerce, and trade routes a full 1,000 years earlier than previously accepted. In other words, before there were pharaohs building tombs, before there were Greek poets singing of honor and vengeance, before history even had a name, there were sailors. There were merchants. There were dreamers and, maybe fools, willing to risk the angry blue unknown. And their dreams, like so many others, ended in a pile of broken clay, forgotten by everything except the ocean. You might think the scientific community would celebrate this. Another piece of the puzzle, a window into humanity's earliest ambition. But no. Instead, the Dokos wreck caused what historians call, in very technical terms, an academic meltdown. Experts scrambled for explanations. Maybe the pots drifted there? Nope, too heavy. Maybe it wasn't really a shipwreck? Then why the clear outline of a vessel's cargo hold? Maybe it was a ceremonial dumping ground? For hundreds of expensive trade goods? Sure, makes perfect sense. In the end, the best answer anyone could offer was, "We don't know." Which is academic speak for, please stop asking before we have to rewrite entire textbooks. Today, the Dokos wreck remains officially categorized as the oldest known shipwreck, and unofficially categorized as an incredibly awkward problem for maritime archaeologists. Because if sailors were crisscrossing the Aegean Sea thousands of years earlier than we thought, what else have we missed? What other silent, broken ships still wait in the blackness, laughing at the certainty of modern science? The thing about oceans is, they don't preserve timelines. They preserve contradictions. As you drift above the scattered bones of the Dokos wreck, as you imagine that long-vanished ship slipping beneath waves that no human eye will ever see again, you realize something chilling. Civilizations vanish faster than stories. But the sea remembers everything. And just when you think you've grasped the limits of ancient ambition, you learn that ambition always came first. Long before history was written, it was sailed. If the Dokos wreck was the first whisper of seafaring ambition, then the next ship was its fever dream, asterisk. A ship so rich, so impossible, so utterly wrong for its time that even now it feels like fiction. And yet, it's real. Somewhere off the Turkish coast, the Uluburun shipwreck still gleams under the weight of 3,000 years of unanswered questions. The Uluburun shipwreck. Off the southern coast of Turkey, in waters as blue and innocent as a postcard, lies a shipwreck that shouldn't exist. The Uluburun shipwreck is not just old, it is absurd. It is offensive to everything we thought we knew about the Bronze Age, because when it went down, around 1300 BC, it took half the known world with it. Discovered by a lucky sponge diver in 1982, the Uluburun shipwreck sprawled across the seafloor like the fossilized skeleton of an empire. 9 years of excavation later, what archaeologists surfaced was not a fishing boat, not a coastal skiff, not a humble trader. It was a floating treasure chest, a mobile United Nations of the ancient world. Copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic, glass from Mesopotamia, gold and jewelry crafted in the style of Mycenaean Greece. Egyptian scarabs bearing the name of Nefertiti's father, Canaanite jars still stained with resin. Weapons, cosmetics, musical instruments, ceremonial daggers, the hoarded luxuries of at least a dozen different civilizations, all heaped together like the lost luggage of a globe-trotting tyrant. This wasn't a trader, this was a statement. A floating proof that by 1300 BC, a vast interconnected world already existed, and it was richer, stranger, and far more dangerous than historians were prepared to admit. The ship itself was built in the shell-first technique, an advanced method where the hull planks are constructed before the internal frame is added. This technique had to be invented, tested, and perfected long before this ship ever sailed. And yet, according to the textbooks of the early 20th century, large-scale international trade, skilled shipwrights, and complex cargo management weren't supposed to exist until much, much later. It is almost as if history was happening off-script. The ship carried enough copper and tin to arm an army with bronze weapons, enough luxury goods to buy off kings, enough raw wealth to fund the rise or fall of a minor city-state. And all of it in one place, riding the treacherous seas of the Mediterranean, trusting the whims of wind and wave to see it safely home. It did not make it. We don't know why. Storm, piracy, navigation error, pick your favorite apocalypse. All we know is that the ship went down off a rocky promontory, within sight of land, so close to safety that it must have felt like mockery. When archaeologists studied the cargo, they realized something even stranger. The goods were not random. They were curated, selected, tailored almost to meet the shopping list of a palace. It suggests that the Uluburun ship wasn't just carrying trade goods, it was carrying tribute, a gift, a bride price, a bribe. Or perhaps it was fleeing, loot ripped from the temples of dying kingdoms, now trying to outrun the collapse of a civilization. Because around the time the Uluburun ship went down, the Bronze Age world was starting to shake. Empires that had ruled for centuries were crumbling. The sea peoples were ravaging coastlines. Trade networks were snapping like rotted ropes. The darkness was coming. And here, frozen in mid-flight, was the last gasp of that golden world. Some scientists suggest that the Uluburun ship might have belonged to a royal envoy. Others whisper that it was the final cargo of a desperate king trying to pay off warlords or buy allies. But no matter how much data they dredge from the sea, they can't agree on the truth, because the ship, like the civilization it sailed for, is gone. All that's left is the wreckage, the scattered dreams of a world that thought itself immortal, now lying silent in the mud. The Uluburun shipwreck is a time capsule, but it is also a tombstone. It marks the grave of certainty, the grave of tidy historical timelines, the grave of our arrogant belief that we have mapped the past. Because if this ship existed, then how many others richer, stranger, even more impossible, slipped beneath the waves without a trace? The sea remembers everything, but it only shows us what it wants to. And as you drift past the corroded ingots and shattered amphorae of the Uluburun wreck, one truth rises like a ghost from the deep. We were never the first globalists. We were never the first dreamers. We were only the first to forget. If the Uluburun ship carried the treasures of half the world to their watery grave, then the next wreck on our journey carried something even rarer, a map not just of trade, but of human error itself. Because sometimes a ship doesn't need treasure to make history. Sometimes all it needs is the wrong storm at the right time. The Mars. It was supposed to be a monster. The pride of Sweden, the terror of the Baltic. A warship so massive, so heavily armed, so invincible, that kings would think twice before setting sail against it. Its name was Mars, fittingly enough, after the god of war. In 1564, during the Northern 7 Years' War, Mars set out to do what all weapons of its kind are built to do: dominate, intimidate, and if necessary, annihilate. Instead, it exploded. It vanished. It turned into one of the greatest maritime ghost stories Europe had ever seen. And then, almost 450 years later, they found it. The Mars was a ship of obscene ambition. At over 70 meters long and bristling with at least 100 guns, it dwarfed anything else in the Baltic. Its hull was layered with oak thick enough to shrug off cannonballs. Its decks were stocked with musketeers, artillerymen, sailors, and a small floating economy of soldiers prepared to bring devastation wherever they were pointed. Its launch was a statement. Sweden had arrived, and it was tired of being polite about it. In May of 1564, the Mars led the Swedish fleet into battle against the forces of Denmark and Lübeck. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it became a catastrophe. No one agrees exactly what happened. Some say Mars was boarded enemy soldiers swarming up her sides like ants on a wounded lion. Others claim that a fire broke out during the battle, maybe from a cannon shot, maybe from the careless lighting of powder stores. What everyone agrees on is this: Mars exploded with a fury that should not have been possible. The blast was so enormous that it lit up the night sky. Flaming debris rained down onto the waves. Bodies, wood, metal, all hurled outward in a grotesque parody of a funeral. The Mars didn't just sink. It disintegrated. And then it was gone. For centuries, divers searched for the wreck. Legends grew around it. Ghost stories were told about phantom lights seen bobbing above the Baltic where the Mars had vanished. Sailors said the sea itself had swallowed the ship out of rage or pity, burying the arrogance of kings beneath the cold. Then, in 2011, a team of Swedish divers, using sonar and sheer stubbornness, found a wreck in 75 meters of icy water near the island of Öland. It was Mars. Or what was left of it. And here's where the real mystery began. Because the Mars was far too intact. Sure, it was damaged, charred, broken, battered by centuries underwater, but the hull was largely there. The cannons were still aligned, still pointed toward battle. The skeleton of the ship's design was unmistakable. This was not debris scattered by an enormous mid-air explosion. It was something else. The evidence suggested that the ship sank relatively intact, that the explosion had been localized perhaps in the powder magazine or near a storage area but had not annihilated the ship as legend claimed. Which raised a deeply uncomfortable question. Had the story of Mars's spectacular destruction been exaggerated? Or had the truth simply decayed into myth over centuries, like wood rotting under the pressure of deep water? Worse yet, divers found evidence that many aboard the Mars never made it off the ship. Skeletons still littered the site, some still wearing fragments of armor, some tangled among the ship's shattered guns. These men died not in heroic charges or last stands. They died screaming in the darkness as their invincible ship pulled them into the cold embrace of the Baltic. Science tried to explain the Mars in neat terms. Localized fire, powder explosion, water rush. But the deeper divers went, the stranger it got. Why were there signs of secondary fires in places that should have been flooded immediately? Why did some parts of the ship show evidence of intense heat while others were eerily pristine? Why, in short, did the Mars seem less like a ship destroyed by battle, and more like a ship that died of some slow, unseen sickness? Theories flourished. Sabotage, mutiny, structural flaws. Some even muttered about cursed wood, about materials taken from sacred forests where the spirits of the old gods still waited. Because if the Mars was supposed to be the future of naval warfare, its fate hinted at something darker. The future is always an accident waiting to happen. Today, the Mars remains eerily preserved on the seabed. Her nameplate still exists, scorched and broken. Her guns lie silent. The Baltic's cold waters have embalmed her better than any tomb. She is a monument to ambition. And a warning. No matter how big you build your dreams, the sea always builds bigger graves. If the Mars went down under the weight of fire and hubris, the next ship on our journey never even had the dignity of war to blame. Because sometimes a ship doesn't sink from battle, or even from storm. Sometimes it simply ceases to exist. The Nanao-1 waits in quiet, shallow waters, a ship that sailed calmly into nothingness, carrying secrets it would never explain. The Nanao-1. The Nanao-1 should have made it. It wasn't lost in a typhoon. It wasn't raided by pirates or dragged down by fire. There was no battle, no grand calamity, no visible wound to mark its fall. It sailed out under fair skies, on calm waters, in what should have been the safest stretch of sea on its route. And yet somehow it sank. Quietly. Completely. Without even managing to send out a cry for help. It disappeared into the coastal shallows of the South China Sea and stayed there for 400 years, embalmed in silt and silence. When they found it, the wreck had a question stitched into every splintered beam. How does a ship that was doing everything right still end up dead? The Nanao-1 was a merchant ship. A massive one. Built during the late Ming Dynasty, sometime around the late 1500s, an era when China was at the height of its maritime glory. Its construction boasted thick, sturdy hulls, broad, compartmentalized holds, and an intricate lattice of watertight bulkheads designed to withstand the sea's worst tantrums. It was the workhorse of its empire, hauling porcelain, silk, spices, and precious metals to markets stretching from Japan to Southeast Asia to beyond the Indian Ocean. At the time, the Ming Navy dominated East Asia. Chinese shipbuilders were already perfecting engineering techniques that wouldn't reappear in the West until centuries later. In short, the Nanao I was a technological masterpiece, the kind of ship that history says shouldn't just vanish. And yet, one voyage off the coast of Guangdong Province, just as it rounded the southern tip of Nanao Island, it did. When modern divers stumbled upon the wreck in 2007, they were stunned. The ship was lying on its side, half buried in sediment, cradled by the seabed in waters so shallow that, theoretically, a man could swim down to touch it without even needing air tanks. Inside, they found a time capsule of the late Ming economy. Tons of blue and white porcelain, perfectly preserved. Sandalwood logs, destined to become luxury furniture. Bronze coins, stacked in bundles. Iron cannons, untouched by rust. Personal artifacts, cooking utensils, shoes, even an almost fully intact compass. There were no scorch marks. No wreckage field. No signs of violence, struggle, or panic. Just a ship lying still, as if it had laid itself gently down for a nap it never woke from. The forensic mystery only deepened the longer scientists studied it. First theory: a sudden squall capsized the ship. But weather records from that region suggest no storms at the time. Besides, the Nanao I was designed to survive much worse. Second theory: navigational error. But the ship was operating close to the coast, along a well-traveled, almost bulletproof route. Experienced captains had sailed it 100 times without incident. Third theory: sabotage. Perhaps the crew mutinied, perhaps the ship was intentionally scuttled. Except no human remains were found trapped aboard. No signs of internal struggle. And no evidence that anyone ever tried to recover the incredibly valuable cargo afterward. Who abandons a fortune without a fight? Somewhere between the lines of broken wood and lost treasure, a darker possibility began to whisper. Maybe the ship wasn't sabotaged. Maybe it wasn't sunk by force or storm. Maybe the Nanao I was already rotting inside. Because the Ming Dynasty, for all its glittering achievements, was starting to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Corruption riddled the bureaucracy. Maintenance of ships, once a point of pride, often gave way to corner-cutting and cheap repairs. Officials falsified inspections, captains bribed their way into licenses, shipwrights shaved quality to meet impossible deadlines. In other words, the empire was sinking long before its ships did. Maybe the Nanao I's hull had already been weakened by rot, termites, inferior timber. Maybe her bulkheads, once marvels of engineering, had quietly buckled under unseen strain. Maybe her cargo was too heavy, her decks too thin, her nails too brittle. And when the smallest crack opened, when the first board gave way, the sea rushed in without mercy. Not with a roar. Not with a scream. But with a soft, almost tender, embrace. A slow death. A bureaucratic death. The kind of death civilizations specialize in. Today, the Nanao I remains one of the most valuable underwater finds in Chinese history. A museum of ambition, greed, craftsmanship, and fatal neglect. Scientists can map her dimensions. Historians can trace her trade routes. Economists can calculate her cargo's worth. But nobody can tell you the exact moment she failed. Nobody can show you the captain's face as the deck tilted under his feet. Nobody can hear the last wet gasp of a ship realizing it had been betrayed from within. The Nanao I teaches a lesson that modern powers would do well to remember. Sometimes, your enemies don't have to sink you. Sometimes, all you need is yourself. If the Nanao 1 died of quiet corruption, the next wreck we face was born of the exact opposite: brutal, spectacular violence. Because not all shipwrecks are polite enough to slip away in silence. Some tear themselves apart so savagely that the ocean can't bury them, it can only stand aside and watch. Off the rocky shores of Tunisia, the Mahdia shipwreck waits, tangled in art, blood, and unanswered prayers. Like what you're sinking into? Hit subscribe, the mysteries get deeper, the wrecks get weirder, and trust us, the sea's not done with us yet. The Mahdia shipwreck. The Mahdia shipwreck does not whisper. It does not fade politely into the endless, polite blue of the Mediterranean. It demands to be noticed, even from its grave. Imagine a shipwreck so luxurious, so grotesquely rich, that when it finally broke apart and sank into the waves, it did so surrounded by a slow-motion avalanche of sculptures, furniture, gold, bronze, and marble, the bleeding artifacts of a world teetering on the edge of collapse. That is Mahdia. A shipwreck where beauty went to drown. The Mahdia shipwreck was discovered in 1907 by Greek sponge divers, because history has a strange sense of humor about who gets to find its bones. Off the coast of Tunisia, tangled in the reefs near Mahdia, they found bronze statues lying like fallen gods on the seabed. Architectural fragments. Intricately carved furniture. Bundles of marble columns, still strapped together as if they had been destined for some palace that now only exists in dreams. At first glance, it looked like the ruins of a temple. At second glance, it looked like a crime scene. Over the next few years, archaeologists dredged up hundreds of artifacts, some Greek, some Roman, some Eastern Mediterranean, all dating roughly to the 1st century BC, a time when the Mediterranean was less a lake of trade and more a battleground for the crumbling ambitions of empires. And yet, no ship remains were ever found. Not the timbers. Not the sails. Not even the nails. Only the cargo survived, like a diary ripped from the hands of a drowning man. The deeper they dug, the stranger the story got. Many of the sculptures were unfinished. Statues still bore the rough chiseling of their creators, suggesting they were being transported not as looted treasure, but as raw inventory destined for the workshops of some wealthy patron. Other objects, however, were unmistakably priceless. Massive, completed works of art, their craftsmanship rivaling anything in a Roman emperor's private collection. Whoever loaded this ship knew exactly what they were doing. This was not random plunder. This was a curated shipment. An ancient luxury haul, a high-risk, high-reward gamble to ferry the glittering detritus of one civilization into the hands and vaults of another. The obvious suspects immediately leapt to mind. The Romans. The Greeks. The North Africans. And yet no single culture fit neatly. The artifacts blended styles, periods, and techniques in ways that suggested something messier. A world where art, trade, war, and theft were not so easily separated. So, what happened to the Mahdia ship? First theory: piracy. A heavily laden ship, vulnerable and slow, attacked and stripped of its crew, left to sink under the weight of its own stolen cargo. Second theory: storm. A sudden gale whipping the coast, smashing the ship against the reefs, sending priceless artifacts tumbling into the depths. Third theory: war. Perhaps the ship was caught between feuding powers, Rome flexing against Carthaginian remnants, or local warlords carving up the dying pieces of Hellenistic kingdoms. Each theory has its evidence. Each has its holes. There are no weapons found near the site. No signs of a battle fought to the last man. No mass graves or shattered armor. Only art. Only beauty, broken and drowning. As if the ship was not a casualty of violence, but of indifference. As if the ship mattered less than the cargo it carried. The Mahdia shipwreck, in the end, feels almost deliberate. Not a ship sunk by accident, but a ship murdered by the inevitable, slow violence of history itself. Because by the 1st century BC, the Mediterranean wasn't a highway of flourishing trade. It was a carcass being picked apart by the vultures of empire. Rome was expanding mercilessly. Greece was crumbling under its own philosophical weight. Egypt was slipping toward the claws of Caesar. Art, trade, and culture were not safe passengers. They were commodities, weapons, bargaining chips. In such a world, perhaps the Magia ship's death was not an accident at all. Perhaps it was simply another transaction. One where the ship itself was considered an acceptable loss. Today, the artifacts from Madia sit behind glass in museums, polished, labeled, catalogued, the chaos of their death erased by curatorial precision. Visitors stroll past the bronze statues, the marble fragments, the battered furniture, never realizing that every crack, every fracture, every missing limb tells the story of a ship that died screaming under the weight of its own ambition. And in that sense, the Madia wreck isn't really ancient history. It's modern history too. A reminder that civilizations are always sinking, usually under the burden of the beauty they once thought would save them. If Madia was the art of drowning, the next shipwreck is the art of surviving against all odds, against every law of physics and decay. Because somewhere in the dead, crushing depths of the Black Sea, a ship lies so perfectly preserved, it might as well have set sail yesterday. And it dares us to ask the most uncomfortable question of all. If the sea can keep a ship this perfectly intact for 2,000 years, what else is it keeping intact that we haven't found yet? The Apollonia shipwreck. In the Black Sea, at a depth where no sunlight dares to intrude and no oxygen can rot the bones of history, there lies a ship so perfectly preserved it defies everything we thought we knew about death. It rests upright, its masts still standing, its rudder intact, its oars frozen mid-motion, as if the crew had simply vanished between heartbeats and left their vessel drifting in the darkness. It is the Apollonia shipwreck. And it should not exist. Discovered in 2018 by a team of maritime archaeologists from the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, the Apollonia wreck sent immediate shockwaves through the academic world. Dating back to around the 5th century BC, this ship had survived not for decades, not even for centuries, but for 2.5 millennia untouched, unrotted, unnervingly whole. The secret, of course, is the Black Sea itself. Below about 150 meters, the Black Sea becomes a tomb of anoxic water, a place where oxygen disappears, bacteria starve, and decay simply stops. A place where death, once achieved, becomes permanent. But no one had expected to find something like this. An ancient Greek trading vessel, lying on its side, still clutching the seafloor, with an almost desperate kind of dignity. The ship is small by modern standards. Roughly 23 meters long. Built for coastal trade, not empire building. Its design, single mast, square sail, curving hull, matches the kinds of ships painted on ancient Greek pottery, the ones scholars thought were idealized, fictional, more symbolic than real. Except now, staring at the Apollonia wreck, we know. Those paintings weren't artistic fantasies. They were blueprints. The ancients built ships that looked exactly like that, and at least once, one of them survived the impossible. Archaeologists marveled at the details. The anchor, still resting where it was dropped. The rudder, lying neatly across the stern. The mast, collapsed but intact, like the snapped neck of a frozen animal. Cargo jars still nestled in the hold, cradled by the ship's embrace. The Apollonia ship is not a reconstruction. It is not a guess. It is a frozen scream. A perfect, awful snapshot of a moment when life, movement, and ambition simply stopped. As always, the questions came next. How did it sink? Storm? Piracy? Structural failure? Maybe. Maybe all of the above. Maybe none. There are no battle scars on the hull. No sign of collision or explosion. No great wounds ripped into its sides. It seems to have sunk almost gently, as if it gave up, as if it exhaled its last breath and slipped under without a fight. A cargo ship running late. A storm too far from land. A single leak, too slow to panic over until it was too late. Human error wrapped in hubris, the classic story of every civilization that ever dared the water. And then, there's the most unsettling question. Where is the crew? No skeletons have been definitively identified in or near the wreck. No mass grave in the silt. No remains clutching the sides of the ship in desperate escape. Did they jump overboard? Were they rescued? Or did the sea simply digest them more thoroughly than it did their ship? The Apollonia wreck floats in that gap, that cruel void where certainty used to live. We know the ship. We do not know their faces. We never will. The discovery of the Apollonia wreck isn't just an archaeological triumph. It's a philosophical insult. Because it proves, beyond any argument, that time does not erase everything equally. Some things rot and vanish. Others, absurdly, stubbornly, survive. We assume that history is what we choose to remember. The Apollonia ship proves that history is also what the sea refuses to forget. We did not save this ship. We did not preserve it. We did not honor it. It survived in spite of us. Because the sea, indifferent and omnivorous, decided to make it part of its collection. Not as a monument. Not as a lesson. As a mistake left open for anyone arrogant enough to look. Today, the Apollonia wreck remains where it was found. Too fragile, too sacred, too cursed perhaps, to be dragged into the air again. It is scanned, photographed, analyzed, but not moved. Its grave is left undisturbed, a ghost ship perfectly embalmed by the dark chemistry of death. It waits in a silence older than cities, older than gods. A silence that hums with the terrifying certainty that if we could see everything buried down there, we would not sleep again. If the Apollonia ship survived because the Black Sea embalmed it, the next ship we meet was not so lucky. Because some ships, no matter how perfectly built, no matter how lovingly crafted, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Some ships sail not to trade or to explore, but to disappear and to take their secrets down with them. And when they go, they leave behind not perfect skeletons, but rotting contradictions too stubborn to sink completely. The Pabuç-Bernu shipwreck. The Aegean Sea, in its endless blue boredom, keeps secrets. It keeps them slumped under centuries of sand, cradled in the jaws of reef and ruin, patiently waiting for someone arrogant enough to believe we already know how history worked. The Pabuç-Bernu shipwreck is one of those secrets. A small, sturdy merchant vessel that should not have existed when it did, built using techniques that wouldn't be common until centuries later, found broken on the seabed like a prototype abandoned by time itself. In 2002, divers off the coast of Bodrum, Turkey, found it, a shipwreck dating to the 6th century BC. Compared to the drama of larger wrecks, Pabuç-Bernu is a modest thing. Roughly 12 meters long, a quiet working ship, the ancient equivalent of a battered cargo van, schlepping goods up and down the coastlines of a scattered, fragmented world. But modesty is deceiving. Because the more archaeologists dug into the wreck, the more uncomfortable it became. The Pabuç-Bernu was not built like other ships of its time. Where most ancient Greek ships were still sewn together, literally stitched with ropes binding plank to plank, this vessel was built using mortise and tenon joints. Small carved sockets and pegs that lock wooden boards together, creating a frame strong enough to shrug off storm and time alike. This was a method associated with centuries later with the grandeur of classical Greece, not its awkward, experimental adolescence. It was as if someone had looked 200 years into the future, stolen a shipwright's secrets, and hammered together a prototype while the rest of humanity was still fumbling with twine. Inside the ship, the cargo told a similar story. It wasn't treasure. It wasn't luxury. It was wine and agricultural goods packed into amphorae, neatly stacked, clearly intended for humble, practical trade. No royal insignias. No weapons of conquest. No gold-plated idols. This ship wasn't trying to be famous. It was just trying to make its deliveries. And yet, by existing at all, it became infamous. Why would a simple merchant need such an advanced ship? Why spend the extra labor, the extra resources, the extra brilliance? Theories swarm like sharks. Some argue that the mortise and tenon construction wasn't originally Greek at all, that it was borrowed from Phoenician or Egyptian shipbuilders, bleeding across cultures in the messy cross-pollination of the ancient world. Others suggest an isolated genius, a single shipwright in some forgotten coastal village, experimenting wildly, building a better ship because nobody had told him he wasn't supposed to yet. Or perhaps it was a desperate adaptation, a response to changing conditions, bigger waves, heavier cargoes, more ambitious routes. Because when the world changes, the smart either innovate or drown. And sometimes, innovation looks exactly like heresy. The fate of the Pabuch Bernu ship, fittingly, remains a question without an answer. It sank, yes. But why? There are no signs of battle. No signs of sudden catastrophic failure. No clues carved into the wood or cargo. Maybe it overloaded. Maybe a sudden gust cracked its experimental frame. Maybe it sailed too close to a reef in the dark. Or maybe, and this is the delicious possibility, the ship didn't sink because it was poorly built. It sank precisely because it was ahead of its time. In a world that wasn't ready for it, a better ship could easily be a death sentence. Better doesn't mean immortal. It just means you drown a little further from shore. Today, the Pabuch Bernu wreck is studied, modeled, debated. Historians argue over its place in the evolution of naval architecture, carving neat little diagrams to explain away what, deep down, still doesn't make any damn sense. Because every so often, history coughs up something that doesn't fit. And when it does, scholars have two choices: pretend it was inevitable, or admit that, sometimes, the past was better at the future than we are. The Pabuch Bernu ship is gone. The crew is nameless. The cargo, once so important, lies shattered in 1,000 anonymous pieces. All that remains is the question: how many other miracles drowned before the world was ready to understand them? If the Pabuch Bernu ship hints at secret trades and borrowed brilliance, the next wreck in our journey throws subtlety overboard completely. Because some ships didn't just hint at impossible trade routes. They loaded their decks with goods from half the known world, hoisted their sails, and dared the ocean to stop them. The next shipwreck is the Yasiata wreck, a Byzantine ship carrying a cultural Frankenstein's cargo, and proving that even when civilizations try to unite, the sea prefers to tear them apart. The Gadawaya shipwreck. There are places human beings were never meant to reach. Places where light fails, where pressure crushes, where even sound gives up. The bottom of the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka is one of those places. And yet, impossibly more than 30 meters below the surface, half buried in silt and stone, lies a shipwreck older than history itself. The Gadawaya wreck. A ship that should never have sailed where it sank. And yet it did. Because ambition always outruns caution, and sometimes it drags entire civilizations with it. In 2003, Sri Lankan divers stumbled upon a strange collection of ancient artifacts scattered across the seabed. Ceramic jars, stone grinders, iron tools, and beneath them all, the fragmented bones of a ship whose builders were long forgotten. At first, it seemed like an ordinary find, another piece of the endless wreckage of human hubris. The ocean is so good at hiding. But then, the dating came back. The Gadawaya wreck is at least 2,000 years old, possibly older, making it the oldest known deep-sea shipwreck in the Indian Ocean. And that was a problem. Because 2,000 years ago, ships weren't supposed to be there. Ancient maritime trade was supposed to hug the coasts, sticking close to land where sailors could see the shore, find fresh water, and avoid the hungry abyss beyond. Sailing into the open ocean wasn't brave. It was suicidal. And yet, here was a ship, laden with cargo, hundreds of meters offshore, sunk in deep water where no ancient mariner was supposed to have dared to go. The cargo itself deepened the mystery. The Gadawaya ship wasn't carrying treasure. It wasn't a warship. It was a working vessel packed with everyday goods. Jars of rice and grain. Iron ingots. Tools for farming and building. Pottery, rough and practical. This was a merchant ship, ferrying the bones of civilization itself, the unglamorous necessities of a growing world. A lifeline between cities and cultures, sailing routes that historians had insisted didn't exist yet. Because the official story of maritime trade at the time was one of caution, conservatism, incremental steps. Not mad, open sea leaps into black water. And yet here was proof that someone, some forgotten trader, some desperate captain had decided to bet everything on the deep. Maybe the winds were favorable. Maybe the profits were too tempting. Maybe they simply didn't know how far from safety they had drifted. Either way, the ocean answered. Why did the Gadawaya ship sink? The guesses are grim and plentiful. A sudden storm, blowing in from the vastness of the Indian Ocean, could have shredded the sails, snapped the mast, capsized the ship in minutes. A hull breach, tiny at first, invisible under the surface, could have widened silently until it was too late to bail. Or the ship could have simply sailed too far, too deep, too fast, and found itself swallowed whole by an ocean that doesn't care about maps. There's a cruel poetry to it. A ship carrying the tools of life, dying alone in the world's loneliest waters. The discovery of the Gadawaya wreck forced historians to rethink the timeline of Indian Ocean trade. It wasn't supposed to be this sophisticated, this daring, this ambitious 2,000 years ago. But it was. Because history isn't a polite staircase, climbing neatly one step at a time. It's a drunken sprint across a minefield. Innovation happens when desperate people with nothing left to lose gamble on insanity, and sometimes they win. Other times, their bones wash up on beaches scholars won't find for millennia. Today, the Gadawaya wreck is still being explored. Its full story, who built it, where it was headed, why it dared the open sea, remains buried under layers of coral, sand, and wishful thinking. Every jar, every plank, every corroded tool pulled from the deep is another fragment of a story that refuses to explain itself. Because the Gadawaya ship isn't a monument to triumph. It's a tombstone, carved for those who gambled against the dark and lost. The ocean does not reward courage. It does not punish cowardice. It only measures ambition in drowned ships and forgotten names. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the Gadawaya ship whispering from its watery grave. We tried. We almost made it. Remember us. If the Gadawaya shipwreck shows us that humanity's reach always exceeded its grasp, the next wreck reminds us that even when ambition wins, when technology, courage, and trade stretch across oceans, time has a longer memory than any empire. Because next, we dive into the Belitung shipwreck. An Arab dhow carrying treasures from the Chinese Tang dynasty sunk in the middle of nowhere, with nobody left to explain how. The Gadawaya shipwreck. There are places human beings were never meant to reach. Places where light fails, where pressure crushes, where even sound gives up. The bottom of the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka is one of those places. And yet, impossibly more than 30 meters below the surface, half buried in silt and stone, lies a shipwreck older than history itself. The Gadawaya wreck. A ship that should never have sailed where it sank. And yet it did. Because ambition always outruns caution, and sometimes it drags entire civilizations with it. In 2003, Sri Lankan divers stumbled upon a strange collection of ancient artifacts scattered across the seabed. Ceramic jars, stone grinders, iron tools, and beneath them all, the fragmented bones of a ship whose builders were long forgotten. At first, it seemed like an ordinary find, another piece of the endless wreckage of human hubris. The ocean is so good at hiding. But then, the dating came back. The Gadawaya wreck is at least 2,000 years old, possibly older, making it the oldest known deep-sea shipwreck in the Indian Ocean. And that was a problem. Because 2,000 years ago, ships weren't supposed to be there. Ancient maritime trade was supposed to hug the coasts, sticking close to land where sailors could see the shore, find fresh water, and avoid the hungry abyss beyond. Sailing into the open ocean wasn't brave. It was suicidal. And yet, here was a ship, laden with cargo, hundreds of meters offshore, sunk in deep water where no ancient mariner was supposed to have dared to go. The cargo itself deepened the mystery. The Gadawaya ship wasn't carrying treasure. It wasn't a warship. It was a working vessel packed with everyday goods. Jars of rice and grain, iron ingots, tools for farming and building, pottery, rough and practical. This was a merchant ship, ferrying the bones of civilization itself, the unglamorous necessities of a growing world. A lifeline between cities and cultures, sailing routes that historians had insisted didn't exist yet. Because the official story of maritime trade at the time was one of caution, conservatism, incremental steps. Not mad, open sea leaps into black water. And yet here was proof that someone, some forgotten trader, some desperate captain had decided to bet everything on the deep. Maybe the winds were favorable. Maybe the profits were too tempting. Maybe they simply didn't know how far from safety they had drifted. Either way, the ocean answered. Why did the Gadawaya ship sink? The guesses are grim and plentiful. A sudden storm, blowing in from the vastness of the Indian Ocean, could have shredded the sails, snapped the mast, capsized the ship in minutes. A hull breach tiny at first, invisible under the surface, could have widened silently until it was too late to bail. Or the ship could have simply sailed too far, too deep, too fast, and found itself swallowed whole by an ocean that doesn't care about maps. There's a cruel poetry to it. A ship carrying the tools of life, dying alone in the world's loneliest waters. The discovery of the Gadawaya wreck forced historians to rethink the timeline of Indian Ocean trade. It wasn't supposed to be this sophisticated, this daring, this ambitious 2,000 years ago. But it was. Because history isn't a polite staircase, climbing neatly one step at a time. It's a drunken sprint across a minefield. Innovation happens when desperate people with nothing left to lose gamble on insanity, and sometimes they win. Other times, their bones wash up on beaches scholars won't find for millennia. Today, the Gadawaya wreck is still being explored. Its full story, who built it, where it was headed, why it dared the open sea, remains buried under layers of coral, sand, and wishful thinking. Every jar, every plank, every corroded tool pulled from the deep is another fragment of a story that refuses to explain itself. Because the Gadawaya ship isn't a monument to triumph. It's a tombstone, carved for those who gambled against the dark and lost. The ocean does not reward courage. It does not punish cowardice. It only measures ambition in drowned ships and forgotten names. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the Gadawaya ship whispering from its watery grave. We tried. We almost made it. Remember us. If the Gadawaya shipwreck shows us that humanity's reach always exceeded its grasp, the next wreck reminds us that even when ambition wins, when technology, courage, and trade stretch across oceans, time has a longer memory than any empire. Because next, we dive into the Belitung shipwreck. An Arab dhow carrying treasures from the Chinese Tang dynasty sunk in the middle of nowhere, with nobody left to explain how. The Kyrenia shipwreck. Some ships vanish without a trace, swallowed whole by the indifference of the deep. Some leave wreckage, screams, and rumors. And some, a precious few, die so precisely, so cleanly, that their skeletons become instruction manuals for the dead. The Kyrenia shipwreck is one of those. A ship so perfectly preserved in its watery grave that it accidentally became the Rosetta Stone for ancient seafaring, and a quiet, eerie reminder that not all losses look like catastrophes. Some losses look like preservation. In 1965, a local diver off the coast of Kyrenia, Cyprus, spotted something strange. Not just scattered artifacts or broken planks, but the shape of a ship sleeping upright beneath the waves, cradled perfectly in a shallow seabed. Archaeologists descended. And what they uncovered was staggering. The Kyrenia ship dates to around the 4th century BC, the age of classical Greece, a time of philosophers and empires, of war and exploration and endless ambition. But this ship wasn't built for glory. It was a humble merchant vessel, roughly 14 meters long, modestly wide, with a single mast and a square sail, designed not for battles but for stubborn, grinding survival. It had made the run between islands and cities dozens, maybe hundreds of times. Carrying cargo. Carrying people. Carrying the invisible lifeblood of ancient civilization, olive oil, almonds, wine, amphorae, packed to the brim with trade goods so mundane, no poet would ever bother singing about them. The construction was a masterclass of efficiency. Shell first building method, hull assembled before the frame. Mortise and tenon joinery, pegs and sockets locking the planks together like a wooden skeleton. Lead sheeting hammered into the hull to seal leaks and fend off parasites. Every inch of the ship was built for one purpose: endure. Not impress. Not dominate. Not innovate. Just survive. And for decades, it did. Until, one day, it didn't. How the Kyrenia ship met its end is still a slow-motion mystery. There's no obvious battle damage. No burns, no smashed planks from collision. Instead, the evidence suggests something quieter and crueler. A violent storm, perhaps. Sudden winds pushing the ship off course. Cargo shifting, making the vessel unstable. The hull breaching slowly, water rushing in faster than terrified hands could bail it out. 1 minute, a dependable workhorse. The next, a broken, sinking ghost. The crew, 4 men, according to the scattered remains and sparse evidence, probably tried everything. Rowing. Bailing. Praying. But the sea, as ever, wasn't interested in prayers. And the Kyrenia slipped beneath the waves. What makes the Kyrenia wreck so unique isn't just that it survived. It's how it survived. Protected by a quick burial under sand and silt, the hull remained largely intact. Even the cargo was still there. Amphorae stacked in rows. Fishing gear. Personal belongings, a handful of coins, a wooden spoon, some simple tools. And beneath it all, the ship itself, whispering instructions across the millennia. Thanks to the Kyrenia wreck, modern historians were able to reconstruct ancient shipbuilding techniques that had only been guessed at before. They even built a replica Kyrenia II using the same methods, same tools, same materials. And the replica sailed. Beautifully. Quietly. Obstinately. Just like the original. But if the Kyrenia ship was a gift from the past, it was also a slap in the face. Because it proved that even at the height of Greek civilization, even when Athens and Sparta and Alexander's dreams lit up the world, survival was never guaranteed. You could have the best ship, the best crew, the best cargo, and one bad day would still send you to the bottom of the ocean, forgotten for 2,000 years. Progress doesn't save you. Art doesn't save you. Ambition doesn't save you. Only luck. And sometimes, not even that. Today, the Kyrenia ship sits in a museum, painstakingly preserved, treated like a relic from a sacred world. Tourists snap photos of its battered hull. Historians run their fingers along the warped timbers. Artists sketch its broken bones, trying to recapture something they don't fully understand. They don't realize that what they're looking at isn't triumph. It's exhaustion. It's perseverance punished by randomness. It's survival until survival itself finally failed. The Kyrenia ship reminds us that most of history isn't built by heroes. It's built by tired, stubborn people ferrying olives and wine across dangerous seas, hoping they can make it just one more day. And sometimes, even the most determined don't make it. They just leave a better blueprint for the next dreamers to follow. If the Kyrenia ship was a quiet masterpiece of endurance, the next shipwreck is a different kind of masterclass entirely. A ship so soaked in ambiguity, so tangled in legend and greed and missing identity, that even today, we can't say for sure who it belonged to. The Black Swan wreck. The ocean loves irony. It takes ships built to last forever and turns them into driftwood. It drowns kings and saves fishermen. And sometimes, just to amuse itself, it coughs up a shipwreck so rich, so absurdly valuable, that it could buy a small country and then refuses to tell anyone whose ship it actually was. The Black Swan wreck is one of those jokes. A billion-dollar ghost with no passport, no gravestone, and no apology. In 2007, the world of treasure hunting exploded. A private salvage company called Odyssey Marine Exploration announced they had recovered an enormous haul of silver and gold coins, more than 500,000 pieces, from an unnamed shipwreck in the Atlantic Ocean. The location? Vaguely somewhere off the coast of Portugal. The ship? Unnamed. The origin? Hard to say. Odyssey, of course, called it Black Swan. Because nothing says we have no idea what we just found, quite like a name that basically means unexpected freak event. It was one of the richest underwater finds in history. Silver coins stacked by the ton. Gold jewelry. Ornate artifacts. A fortune so vast it didn't feel real. And yet, in all that wealth, one thing was conspicuously absent. Identity. Normally, shipwrecks come with hints. Names carved into timbers. Insignias stamped into cannons. Paperwork, cargo lists, sailors' belongings. Not Black Swan. There were no flags. No cargo manifest. No obvious evidence pointing to a single country, a single king, a single story. Just money. Raw, glittering, apolitical money. And in the absence of facts, speculation rushed in like seawater through a cracked hull. The most popular theory? The Black Swan wreck was actually the Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, a Spanish frigate sunk by the British in 1804 during an ugly, barely legal encounter off the coast of Portugal. The Mercedes was known to have been carrying immense amounts of treasure back from the Spanish colonies. And inconveniently for Odyssey Marine, Spain immediately filed a lawsuit demanding the treasure's return. Cue years of messy, dramatic, bitter courtroom battles. Odyssey insisted that the wreck was found in international waters, with no clear proof that it was the Mercedes. Spain insisted otherwise, wielding historical records, marine archaeology, and enough diplomatic pressure to sink a small flotilla. In 2012, a U.S. court ruled in Spain's favor. the treasure was packed into 17 enormous military cargo planes and flown back to Madrid under heavy guard, as if it might try to escape. And yet, even after all that drama, uncertainty clung to the Black Swan wreck like barnacles. Some scholars still whispered doubts. Was it really the Mercedes? The cargo didn't perfectly match. The artifacts didn't align as neatly as they should have. Other theories suggested the Black Swan might have been a composite wreck. Multiple ships, multiple stories, collapsed into one jumbled underwater grave. And the biggest question of all, if the Black Swan wasn't the Mercedes, then where is the real Mercedes? The ocean, of course, remains silent. It doesn't care who won the lawsuit. It doesn't care who minted the coins. It doesn't care what name is carved into the history books. It only cares that another ship sank. Another dream failed. Another mountain of human ambition ended up feeding the fish. Today, the treasure sits in Spanish museums, labeled and categorized, but still bearing the faint stink of uncertainty. Visitors gaze at the piles of silver and gold, marveling at the wealth of forgotten empires. They don't realize they're looking at a monument to ignorance. A glittering tomb for a story we will likely never fully know. Because the Black Swan wreck is not a triumph of archaeology. It's a reminder that even when you win, you might still be wrong. The Black Swan teaches us a brutal lesson. Sometimes, you find everything and still understand nothing. The coins survive. The truth drowns. Good catch, you're absolutely right. We already fully covered the Mahdia shipwreck back in segment 5. The Black Swan wreck. The ocean loves irony. It takes ships built to last forever and turns them into driftwood. It drowns kings and saves fishermen. And sometimes, just to amuse itself, it coughs up a shipwreck so rich, so absurdly valuable, that it could buy a small country and then refuses to tell anyone whose ship it actually was. The Black Swan wreck is one of those jokes. A billion-dollar ghost with no passport, no gravestone, and no apology. In 2007, the world of treasure hunting exploded. A private salvage company called Odyssey Marine Exploration announced they had recovered an enormous haul of silver and gold coins, more than 500,000 pieces, from an unnamed shipwreck in the Atlantic Ocean. The location? Vaguely somewhere off the coast of Portugal. The ship? Unnamed. The origin? Hard to say. Odyssey, of course, called it Black Swan. Because nothing says we have no idea what we just found, quite like a name that basically means unexpected freak event. It was one of the richest underwater finds in history. Silver coins stacked by the ton. Gold jewelry. Ornate artifacts. A fortune so vast it didn't feel real. And yet, in all that wealth, one thing was conspicuously absent. Identity. Normally, shipwrecks come with hints. Names carved into timbers. Insignias stamped into cannons. Paperwork, cargo lists, sailors' belongings. Not Black Swan. There were no flags. No cargo manifest. No obvious evidence pointing to a single country, a single king, a single story. Just money. Raw, glittering, apolitical money. And in the absence of facts, speculation rushed in like seawater through a cracked hull. The most popular theory? The Black Swan wreck was actually the Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, a Spanish frigate sunk by the British in 1804 during an ugly, barely legal encounter off the coast of Portugal. The Mercedes was known to have been carrying immense amounts of treasure back from the Spanish colonies. And inconveniently for Odyssey Marine, Spain immediately filed a lawsuit demanding the treasure's return. Cue years of messy, dramatic, bitter courtroom battles. Odyssey insisted that the wreck was found in international waters, with no clear proof that it was the Mercedes. Spain insisted otherwise, wielding historical records, marine archaeology, and enough diplomatic pressure to sink a small flotilla. In 2012, a U.S. court ruled in Spain's favor. The treasure was packed into 17 enormous military cargo planes and flown back to Madrid under heavy guard, as if it might try to escape. And yet, even after all that drama, uncertainty clung to the Black Swan wreck like barnacles. Some scholars still whispered doubts. Was it really the Mercedes? The cargo didn't perfectly match. The artifacts didn't align as neatly as they should have. Other theories suggested the Black Swan might have been a composite wreck. Multiple ships, multiple stories, collapsed into one jumbled underwater grave. And the biggest question of all, if the Black Swan wasn't the Mercedes, then where is the real Mercedes? The ocean, of course, remains silent. It doesn't care who won the lawsuit. It doesn't care who minted the coins. It doesn't care what name is carved into the history books. It only cares that another ship sank. Another dream failed. Another mountain of human ambition ended up feeding the fish. Today, the treasure sits in Spanish museums, labeled and categorized, but still bearing the faint stink of uncertainty. Visitors gaze at the piles of silver and gold, marveling at the wealth of forgotten empires. They don't realize they're looking at a monument to ignorance. A glittering tomb for a story we will likely never fully know. Because the Black Swan wreck is not a triumph of archaeology. It's a reminder that even when you win, you might still be wrong. The Black Swan teaches us a brutal lesson. Sometimes, you find everything and still understand nothing. The coins survive. The truth drowns. Good catch, you're absolutely right. We already fully covered the Mahdia shipwreck back in segment 5. The San Jose Galleon. Some ships carry gold. Some carry glory. And some carry the heavy, poisonous weight of history itself, enough to sink not just themselves, but the futures of the men who chased them. The San Jose Galleon is that ship. A Spanish treasure galleon so overloaded with wealth that when it exploded and disappeared beneath the waters off Cartagena in 1708, it didn't just sink, it created a legend, a curse, and a courtroom battle that still hasn't ended. The San Jose was part of the Spanish treasure fleet, a massive convoy designed to ferry back the spoils of the New World, gold, silver, emeralds, and other stolen riches to the coffers of a crown perpetually at war. In 1708, the War of Spanish Succession was raging across Europe, and the San Jose was a fat, golden target bobbing on the ocean, escorted by a fleet that was supposed to be strong enough to deter even the most desperate pirates. It wasn't. The British Navy, desperate for funds and eager to cripple Spanish power, launched a brutal ambush near Cartagena, Colombia. The battle was quick, savage, and catastrophic. The San Jose never had a chance. Accounts say that her powder magazines exploded mid-fight, a volcanic blast that ripped the ship apart, sending it and its mountain of treasure plunging into the abyss. 600 sailors died instantly. No survivors. No recovery. Just a sudden, brutal silence where a fortune once floated. And what a fortune it was rumored to be. Estimates vary wildly, but conservative guesses suggest the San Jose was carrying between 7 and 11 million pesos worth of gold, silver, and jewels, a figure so immense that it would make it the richest shipwreck ever discovered. Adjusted for modern value, we're talking about several $billion. Enough to fund armies, topple governments, build or destroy empires. And for centuries, that treasure slept, undisturbed, beneath hundreds of meters of cold, dark water. Of course, nothing involving that much money stays quiet forever. In 2015, the Colombian government announced they had found the wreck of the San Jose. Or at least, what they were pretty sure was the San Jose. They released tantalizing photos, cannons with distinctive dolphin engravings, piles of corroded treasure, fragments of Spanish weaponry. But they refused to release the exact coordinates, treating the wreck's location as a state secret. Instantly, the lawsuits began. Spain, citing historical ownership, claimed the treasure. Colombia, citing national waters, claimed it. Descendants of privateers, citing old salvage rights, claimed it. Private companies, citing prior search contracts, claimed it. Everyone wanted a piece of a ship no one could fully prove they had found. And the irony? The longer they fight over it, the more the San Jose laughs from the bottom of the ocean. Because the wreck lies deep enough, more than 600 meters down, that any recovery will be incredibly difficult, outrageously expensive, and ethically murky. Bringing it up would risk destroying priceless artifacts. Leaving it there feels like surrender. The treasure of the San Jose isn't just gold anymore. It's a mirror. It reflects the same greed, desperation, and arrogance that sent it to the bottom in the first place. The San Jose teaches a brutal truth. We are exactly the same as the men who loaded her with plunder 3 centuries ago. We fight for riches we didn't earn. We squabble over corpses we don't remember. We chase ghosts, convinced they owe us something. And the ocean watches, amused. Because the sea does not return what it takes. It only lends it to the future wrapped in rust, rumor, and regret. Today, the San Jose sleeps under layers of silt, salt, and international litigation. A kingdom's ransom, untouched. A mass grave, unmarked. A monument to the idea that not all fortunes are meant to be recovered, and not all treasures are meant to be spent. Some are meant to stay lost. To remind us what happens when greed outweighs caution, and ambition outweighs wisdom. If the San Jose was a floating empire that exploded under its own weight, the next shipwreck tells a different kind of story. A ship full of copper and ambition, wrecked not by pirates or wars, but by time itself and by a mystery still too young for science to explain. The Unexplained shipwreck. Some shipwrecks are famous before they're found. The San Jose, the Titanic, the Lusitania. Their names echo louder than the oceans that swallowed them. But some wrecks slip through history nameless, wordless, timeless, and when we finally find them, they raise more questions than corpses. The Unexplained shipwreck is one of those silent catastrophes. A Bronze Age vessel, lost so deep in the murk of time that even today it feels more like a hallucination than a fact. Discovered only recently off the coast of Turkey near the Black Sea city of Ereğli, the Unexplained shipwreck immediately tore open a new wound in the timeline of human ambition. It lies in deep water, more than 2,000 meters down, preserved by the Black Sea's deadly anoxic depths, a tomb where oxygen never intrudes, where wood, rope, and bone can survive for millennia without rotting. When sonar scans first picked up the ship's shape, researchers assumed it must be relatively modern. A 19th century merchantman, maybe. A Cold War relic. Something humanly plausible. It wasn't. When remotely operated vehicles descended into the blackness, their floodlights revealed something much older and much more disturbing. A ship built centuries, maybe thousands of years earlier than anyone believed was possible at that depth. A vessel that had no business being where it was, when it was. What little is known about the Unexplained wreck is a fever dream stitched out of contradictions. It appears to date from the Bronze Age, possibly 1,500 to 1,200 BC. It shows advanced construction techniques, mortise and tenon joinery, precise woodworking. Its hull design suggests open water navigation, not just timid coastal hopping. In other words, it's the kind of ship historians would love to pretend didn't exist yet. According to the old stories, Bronze Age seafarers stayed close to shore, terrified of the deep. Trade routes hugged the land like nervous children clutching their mother's skirt. But the Unexplained ship suggests that some anonymous, ambitious, possibly insane ancient sailors pushed far beyond the safe, shallow waters. They sailed into the terrifying, empty blue. And at least once, they didn't come back. What was the Unexplained ship carrying? Nobody knows yet. The wreck has only begun to be explored, and many of its secrets remain buried under centuries of silt and darkness. But early indications suggest the ship might have been hauling copper ingots, perhaps tin, the raw materials of the Bronze Age itself. Metals so valuable they were worth risking death by drowning, pirates, or simply sailing off the edge of the known world. Because bronze was power. Bronze was life. Bronze was empire. And whoever sailed the Unexplained ship wasn't taking a pleasure cruise. They were gambling their lives against the endless, hungry dark for the raw stuff of civilization. Why did the Unexplained ship sink? The easy answers are too easy. A sudden storm. Hull fatigue. Navigational error. The problem is that the ship is lying far offshore, in waters far deeper than any known ancient ship was supposed to reach. If it was blown off course, it must have traveled days beyond any known safe port. If it sailed there intentionally, it suggests knowledge, maps, and ambitions we've barely even imagined. Either way, the end was the same. A slow death. A quiet collapse. A ship drifting lower and lower and lower until the pressure of the deep crushed the air from its timbers and left it still and silent on the seabed. Today, the Unexplained shipwreck is a barely explored ghost. Researchers are cautious. The site is fragile. Every movement risks damaging one of the most perfectly preserved Bronze Age artifacts ever found. But the deeper mystery, the one no sonar or robot can answer, is who the sailors were. What drove them beyond the safety of shore? What dreams filled their sails until the ocean filled their lungs? They have no names, no gravestones, no poems, only a wooden whisper in the blackness saying, "We were here. We dared. We died." The Unexplained ship reminds us that ambition doesn't need maps. It only needs fools brave enough to raise their sails into an uncaring sky. And if the sea swallows them whole, well, it keeps better secrets than we ever could. If the Unexplained wreck was a ghost ship trapped between worlds, the next wreck we encounter belonged to a nation that believed it was untouchable. A ship so proud, so arrogant, that it practically sank under the weight of its own hubris, taking an entire imperial dream with it. The Bremen cog. Every empire believes it has solved the ocean. Every merchant thinks they've tamed the tides. Every king believes his fleets are immortal. And then a single ship, broken and buried, turns up centuries later and laughs in their faces. The Bremen cog is one of those ships. A medieval cargo vessel built for domination, found in a place it shouldn't have been, whispering a story of ambition, arrogance, and inevitable collapse. In 1962, construction workers dredging the riverbed near Bremen, Germany stumbled across something strange. Not just another lost fishing boat. Not another forgotten barge. But the nearly complete skeleton of a massive medieval cog, a workhorse of trade, war, and empire during the 14th century. This was not a casual discovery. This was a time capsule. Perfectly preserved in the anaerobic mud of the Weser River, the Bremen cog emerged almost whole, its massive oak planks, iron nails, and towering stern still intact after 6 centuries of rot and war and forgetting. And with it emerged a host of uncomfortable questions. The cog was the backbone of the Hanseatic League, a powerful, sprawling network of merchant cities that dominated trade across the North and Baltic Seas from the 13th to the 17th centuries. Cogs were simple but brutally effective. Broad, flat-bottomed hulls ideal for loading massive amounts of cargo. High sides to defend against pirates. A single, towering mast with a square sail, built for efficiency rather than elegance. thick timbers that could absorb the battering of storms and sieges alike. These were ships built not for exploration or glory, but for monopoly. For extracting wealth, enforcing trade rights, and crushing competition under the raw weight of better logistics. The Bremen cog, at nearly 24 meters long and 8 meters wide, was the medieval equivalent of a floating fortress. It was meant to be unstoppable. And yet, there it lay. Sunk. Buried. Forgotten. No one knows exactly how or why the Bremen cog went down. The most likely theory is painfully mundane. The ship was under construction or undergoing repairs when a storm surge or sudden river flooding capsized it, driving it deep into the river mud before anyone could react. No heroics. No pirate battles. No grand naval disasters. Just bad timing, bad weather, and bad luck. The oldest enemies of every empire. And then came the historical discomfort. Because the discovery of the Bremen cog forced historians to rethink what they knew about medieval shipbuilding. This ship was far more sophisticated than previously thought. Advanced mortise and tenon joinery techniques adapted for faster, cheaper construction. Iron reinforcements. Modular construction methods that hinted at an early understanding of mass production. The cogs weren't just big floating boxes. They were precision-engineered machines, ugly, practical, ruthlessly optimized for the brutal economics of empire. It turns out medieval merchants weren't bumbling middlemen. They were industrialists, long before the Industrial Revolution had a name. And they built their dreams of profit on ships that were, themselves, monuments to efficiency and fear. The irony? The very success of the cogs sowed the seeds of their obsolescence. As trade expanded, demands changed. New ship designs emerged faster, sleeker, more versatile, able to sail not just coastlines but open oceans. The cog, once the king of medieval seas, became an obsolete relic, replaced by the very innovation its own success had made inevitable. Just another drowned dream in the muddy arteries of Europe. Today, the Bremen cog is displayed in the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven. Visitors stare up at its massive timbers, marveling at the raw, brutal simplicity of it. Children pose for photos. Historians sketch diagrams. Engineers sigh with admiration. But few see the darker story. A machine built to dominate the world, abandoned by history in a muddy river, its empire forgotten except for the taxes, trade agreements, and broken ships left rotting in its wake. The Bremen cog isn't a monument to medieval greatness. It's a caution sign. A reminder that every system, no matter how ruthless or efficient, eventually runs aground. The Bremen cog teaches this. Efficiency is not immortality. Domination is not destiny. And no matter how perfectly you build your ship, the river still rises. If the Bremen cog was the ghost of an empire that thought it had mastered the tides, the next shipwreck is the broken dream of a people who believed even gods could bleed. A ship so grand, so deeply tied to myth and legend, that its bones blur the line between history and hallucination. The Cape Geladonia wreck. Before there were kings, there were traders. Before there were empires, there were sailors hauling copper across seas so wide and violent that it felt like challenging the gods themselves. And before there were written histories, there were shipwrecks, like the one at Cape Geladonia, a pile of broken dreams tangled in the rocks, still bleeding out the old world's ambitions onto the seabed. Off the southern coast of Turkey, near Cape Geladonia, lies the wreckage of a Bronze Age ship. Not a warship. Not a royal barge. A cargo vessel, plain and desperate. Discovered in the 1950s by sponge divers and later excavated under the direction of archaeologist George Bass, it became one of the first fully studied ancient shipwrecks in history. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't headline-grabbing. It was something worse. True. The Cape Caledonia wreck is about 3,200 years old, dating roughly to 1,200 BC, the violent twilight of the Bronze Age, when mighty civilizations were crumbling, cities were burning, and trade routes were snapping like dry twigs. It is a shipwreck frozen at the precise moment when the world shifted from one age to another and forgot to send a lifeboat. The wreck itself is modest. No gold. No ornate weaponry. No fine jewelry. Just copper. Tons of it. Copper ingots, cast into strange, loaf-shaped forms. Copper tools, rough and unfinished. Scrap metal old blades, broken axes, worn-out chisels melted down for recycling. The cargo tells the story clearly. This was a scrap run. An itinerant metal dealer, gathering copper wherever it could be found, transporting it to the few surviving outposts still hungry for bronze. Because by 1200 BC, the world's complex trade networks were collapsing. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were vanishing. The mighty Hittite Empire was breaking apart. Egypt was on life support. And without trade, bronze, the very blood of civilization, could not be made. This ship was not a symbol of flourishing commerce. It was a desperate attempt to keep the lights on a little longer. How did it die? There's no battle damage. No evidence of piracy. Most likely, it simply ran aground during a storm smashed against the rocks of Cape Caledonia by winds too strong to fight. The hull would have broken open. The cargo spilled out. The sailors, whoever they were, either drowned or scrambled ashore, only to vanish into the same history that forgot them. No names. No songs. No survivors. Just copper, rusting quietly at the bottom of the sea. The deeper discomfort came when archaeologists studied the artifacts more closely. The tools and scrap weren't uniform. They came from multiple cultures. Multiple sources. The ship wasn't tied to a single empire or a single people. It was a Frankenstein's monster of the Bronze Age, a patchwork cargo assembled from the ruins of a dying world. This wasn't trade. This was scavenging. The Cape Caledonia wreck is the maritime equivalent of looters picking through the rubble after the city has burned down. It marks the exact moment when ambition gave way to desperation. When commerce gave way to survival. Today, the remains of the Cape Caledonia ship are studied, measured, photographed, but not glamorized. There is no victory here. No romance. Only work. Only need. Only the grinding, endless labor of people trying to hold a crumbling world together with whatever scraps they could carry across a merciless sea. The copper ingots sit in museums now, clean and labeled, their savage story scrubbed away by polite curators. Visitors walk past without realizing that they are looking at the bones of an entire age. The last heartbeat of the Bronze Age, stuttering out into silence beneath the waves. The Cape Caledonia wreck teaches this. Civilizations don't die all at once. They drown in pieces. One ship at a time. One ingot at a time. One forgotten sailor at a time. And the sea remembers them all. If the Cape Caledonia wreck marks the desperate end of a dying world, the next shipwreck represents the opposite. A vessel so modern, so invincible, so proudly armored that it was supposed to be untouchable until physics and fate reminded everyone how fast even the best can bleed. The Cape Caledonia wreck. Before there were kings, there were traders. Before there were empires, there were sailors hauling copper across seas so wide and violent that it felt like challenging the gods themselves. And before there were written histories, there were shipwrecks, like the one at Cape Caledonia, a pile of broken dreams tangled in the rocks, still bleeding out the old world's ambitions onto the seabed. Off the southern coast of Turkey, near Cape Caledonia, lies the wreckage of a Bronze Age ship. Not a warship. Not a royal barge. A cargo vessel, plain and desperate. Discovered in the 1950s by sponge divers and later excavated under the direction of archaeologist George Bass, it became one of the first fully studied ancient shipwrecks in history. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't headline-grabbing. It was something worse. True. The Cape Caledonia wreck is about 3,200 years old, dating roughly to 1,200 BC, the violent twilight of the Bronze Age, when mighty civilizations were crumbling, cities were burning, and trade routes were snapping like dry twigs. It is a shipwreck frozen at the precise moment when the world shifted from one age to another and forgot to send a lifeboat. The wreck itself is modest. No gold. No ornate weaponry. No fine jewelry. Just copper. Tons of it. Copper ingots, cast into strange, loaf-shaped forms. Copper tools, rough and unfinished. Scrap metal old blades, broken axes, worn-out chisels melted down for recycling. The cargo tells the story clearly. This was a scrap run. An itinerant metal dealer, gathering copper wherever it could be found, transporting it to the few surviving outposts still hungry for bronze. Because by 1200 BC, the world's complex trade networks were collapsing. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were vanishing. The mighty Hittite Empire was breaking apart. Egypt was on life support. And without trade, bronze, the very blood of civilization, could not be made. This ship was not a symbol of flourishing commerce. It was a desperate attempt to keep the lights on a little longer. How did it die? There's no battle damage. No evidence of piracy. Most likely, it simply ran aground during a storm smashed against the rocks of Cape Caledonia by winds too strong to fight. The hull would have broken open. The cargo spilled out. The sailors, whoever they were, either drowned or scrambled ashore, only to vanish into the same history that forgot them. No names. No songs. No survivors. Just copper, rusting quietly at the bottom of the sea. The deeper discomfort came when archaeologists studied the artifacts more closely. The tools and scrap weren't uniform. They came from multiple cultures. Multiple sources. The ship wasn't tied to a single empire or a single people. It was a Frankenstein's monster of the Bronze Age, a patchwork cargo assembled from the ruins of a dying world. This wasn't trade. This was scavenging. The Cape Caledonia wreck is the maritime equivalent of looters picking through the rubble after the city has burned down. It marks the exact moment when ambition gave way to desperation. When commerce gave way to survival. Today, the remains of the Cape Caledonia ship are studied, measured, photographed, but not glamorized. There is no victory here. No romance. Only work. Only need. Only the grinding, endless labor of people trying to hold a crumbling world together with whatever scraps they could carry across a merciless sea. The copper ingots sit in museums now, clean and labeled, their savage story scrubbed away by polite curators. Visitors walk past without realizing that they are looking at the bones of an entire age. The last heartbeat of the Bronze Age, stuttering out into silence beneath the waves. The Cape Caledonia wreck teaches this. Civilizations don't die all at once. They drown in pieces. One ship at a time. One ingot at a time. One forgotten sailor at a time. And the sea remembers them all. If the Cape Caledonia wreck marks the desperate end of a dying world, the next shipwreck represents the opposite. A vessel so modern, so invincible, so proudly armored that it was supposed to be untouchable until physics and fate reminded everyone how fast even the best can bleed. The Cristobal Colon. Some ships are born obsolete. Some die heroes. And some, like the Cristobal Colon, manage to be both sinking so quickly, so pointlessly, that even their own flag seemed embarrassed to fly over their wreckage. An armored cruiser that was supposed to defend a dying empire, that instead went down in a mess of confusion and broken promises. If the Cape Caledonia wreck whispered the slow death of the Bronze Age, the Cristobal Colon screamed the fast death of Spain's imperial dreams. The Cristobal Colon was built in Italy for Spain in the late 19th century, part of a desperate last-ditch effort to modernize the Spanish Navy before it got wiped off the map. Launched in 1896, the ship was sleek, fast, and heavily armored. A cruiser designed to run down lighter vessels and outrun heavier ones. It bristled with weaponry, carried state-of-the-art engines, and gleamed like the future. Except, in true imperial fashion, it arrived incomplete. The Cristobal Colon was supposed to mount heavy 10-inch guns. But Spain, scrambling with budget cuts and political chaos, never installed them. When it steamed toward Cuba for the Spanish-American War, it was half a battleship. An armored husk without teeth. A metaphor, if you like, for the Spanish Empire itself. In July 1898, the Cristobal Colon faced its death during the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Trapped in Santiago harbor alongside the rest of Spain's fleet, it tried to escape when the U.S. Navy blockaded the entrance. The Spanish Admiral Pascual Cervera ordered a desperate breakout, a mad, suicidal dash for open water. Cristobal Colon led the charge, using its speed to outrun the American warships that chased it like hounds after a wounded deer. And for a few glorious minutes, it worked. The Colon pulled away from slower American vessels, darting westward along the coast. Victory, or at least survival, shimmered on the horizon. But then, the ship's luck and its coal supply ran out. Literally. In a moment of tactical absurdity, the Cristobal Colon had been loaded with inferior coal, wet, low-grade fuel that burned dirty and inefficiently. As the ship fled, its boilers struggled. Its speed dropped. And the pursuing American battleships, closing the gap with every passing minute, opened fire. The Colon couldn't fight back properly, missing its main guns. It couldn't outrun forever bleeding speed with every boiler cough. Cornered, crippled, and taking fire, the crew had no choice. They ran the ship aground near the mouth of the Turquino River, blew the sea valves, and abandoned her to the surf. The Cristobal Colon settled, broken, smoking, and half-submerged. The last gasp of Spanish naval pride. The absurdity didn't end there. When U.S. forces boarded the wreck, they found it still largely intact. In theory, it could have been salvaged and refitted. But over the next few days, scavengers, both official and unofficial, ripped the ship apart. Fires started. Explosions rocked the remains. Salvage operations flailed. By the time the Americans got organized, the Cristobal Colon was a battered, looted skeleton. More embarrassment than prize. Today, the Cristobal Colon lies shattered off the Cuban coast, a twisted mess of steel and sadness. Its wreckage is visited by divers, historians, and the occasional dreamer looking for relics of a vanished empire. What they find isn't glory. It's failure. Not the failure of a single ship or a single battle, but the failure of a whole system, a whole way of thinking. The Cristobal Colon didn't sink because it was badly built. It sank because it was built on the hollow promises of a dying empire. And like so many wrecks before and after, it teaches the same brutal lesson. Speed can't save you. Armor can't save you. Pride can't save you. When the world changes, you either change with it or you sink. The Mary Rose. Some ships die fighting. Some ships die fleeing. And some ships, like the Mary Rose, die of sheer bloated arrogance, sinking so fast and so stupidly that even centuries later, nobody can agree on who to blame. The Mary Rose wasn't just a warship. She was supposed to be the crown jewel of Henry VIII's navy, a floating fortress, an invincible ironclad before iron even existed. Instead, she tipped over and drowned almost within sight of home. The Mary Rose was launched in 1511, built during Henry VIII's frantic quest to turn England into a serious naval power. She was big, she was mean, and she was cutting edge for her time. Dozens of heavy guns mounted to blast enemy ships out of the water. High, towering castles at bow and stern to rain arrows and gunfire down on opponents. Thick hulls, broad decks, terrifying profile. The Mary Rose was a brute dressed as a lady, and England loved her for it. For decades, she served loyally, fighting in wars against France and Scotland, intimidating smaller fleets, and reminding everyone that England was no longer content to just watch from the shoreline. She was, in a word, a statement. But history has a way of silencing statements. On the 19th of July, 1545, during a battle against an invading French fleet in the Solent, the strait between the Isle of Wight and the English mainland, the Mary Rose set sail one last time. She had just undergone upgrades. More guns, more men, more weight crammed into a hull never designed to carry it. Accounts say she turned to fire her broadside at the French ships, and then, suddenly, violently, capsized. Eyewitnesses watched in horror as she keeled over, open gun ports flooding, men screaming as they were dragged under the water by armor and gear. Of the roughly 500 men aboard, only about 35 survived. The pride of England slipped beneath the waves so fast it didn't even leave time for a heroic story. How could a ship that had sailed proudly for 30 years die so embarrassingly? Historians have clawed at the mystery for centuries. Theories swirl. A sudden gust of wind caught her as she turned, tilting her too far with her gun ports open. The extra weight from her upgrades made her dangerously top-heavy. Poor crew training meant the sailors panicked, failing to balance the ship properly during maneuvers. Maybe it was all of the above. Maybe the Mary Rose didn't sink from a single mistake, but from a dozen small, arrogant decisions stacked too high to survive the first strong breeze. A ship built for intimidation, drowned by its own bluster. The wreck remained lost for centuries, buried in mud and darkness, until divers rediscovered it in the 20th century. The Mary Rose was raised from the seabed in 1982 in a monumental, delicate operation, a half-rotted, mud-caked ghost pulled back into the light after 437 years. And what it revealed was both astonishing and haunting. Weapons, frozen mid-fight. Tools, personal items, meals half-prepared. Human remains still tangled in the wreckage. A perfect snapshot of disaster, preserved by the cold embrace of the Solent silt. A floating time capsule of pride, panic, and failure. Today, the Mary Rose is displayed in a custom-built museum in Portsmouth, England. Visitors can walk alongside the preserved hull, peer into the recovered artifacts, stare into the hollow, broken face of history. But the story the museum tells is still sanitized. A glorious ship. A tragic loss. A brave crew. The darker truth, the truth that hums from every shattered timber and broken sword, is simpler. The Mary Rose wasn't defeated by the French. She was defeated by herself. The Mary Rose teaches this. Victory isn't built on ambition. Survival isn't built on firepower. Success isn't built on national pride. It's built on balance. On humility. On knowing when to say, enough. And when you forget that, no matter how mighty you think you are, the sea will remind you. If the Mary Rose sank under the weight of her own bloated ambition, the next shipwreck shows a different kind of drowning. A ship that seemed to vanish into the water without a sound, leaving no heroic battle, no furious storm. Only the eerie stillness of something that simply stopped being. The Bimini Road wrecks. Some shipwrecks leave broken hulls. Some leave sunken cargo. And then there are wrecks like the ones off Bimini, where the ships are missing, the crew is missing, and even the civilization that supposedly built the place is missing. All that's left are stones, great, weathered blocks, scattered like breadcrumbs across the seafloor, hinting at a harbor nobody can explain. Because sometimes the ocean doesn't just erase ships. It erases entire worlds. The Bimini Road, or Bimini Wall, depending on who you ask, was first spotted in 1968 by divers exploring the shallow waters near Bimini Island in the Bahamas. At a glance, it looks unmistakable. A long, curving line of stone blocks, rectangular and uniform, stretching for hundreds of feet beneath the waves. It looks, in every sense, like an ancient roadway or a collapsed harbor wall. Something built. Something organized. Something deliberate. The blocks are massive, many over 10 feet long, and fit together with an eerie, mechanical neatness, like a drowned boulevard for ships that no longer exist. And that's where the problems begin. Because according to mainstream archaeology, there was no civilization in the Bahamas capable of building anything like this thousands of years ago. At least, not officially. Some scientists argue that the Bimini Road is a natural formation, a phenomenon called beach rock fracturing, where limestone breaks apart along regular, jointed lines and settles into something that looks artificial. Just coincidence. Just geology doing its best imitation of human ambition. Convenient, isn't it? Because the alternative that someone, long before Columbus, long before the Caribs and Arawaks, long before recorded history, built a port or a causeway in the Bahamas, would throw a stick of dynamite into everything we think we know about ancient seafaring. And history, like governments and religions, tends to dislike dynamite. Conspiracy theorists, pseudo-archaeologists, and dreamers, of course, have had a field day. Some claim the Bimini Road is the last fragment of Atlantis, the lost continent Plato teased about, swallowed by the ocean in some forgotten cataclysm. Others suggest it's the work of an undiscovered seafaring culture, one capable of building ports, trading across oceans, and disappearing without leaving so much as a pottery shard behind. And in a delightful little twist, Edgar Cayce, the 20th century mystic known as the Sleeping Prophet, had once predicted that the ruins of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in 1968, right when the Bimini Road was discovered. Coincidence? Naturally. Absolutely. Definitely. Maybe. The problem with Bimini isn't lack of evidence. It's lack of narrative. There are no sunken ships tangled in the stones. No skeletons clutching shattered cargo. No relics. No tools. No pottery. No indisputable fingerprints of humanity. Only the stones. Silent, massive, stubbornly wrong. Too regular to dismiss. Too empty to explain. A harbor without a city. A road without travelers. A monument without a memory. Today, Bimini remains a playground for divers, mystics, skeptics, and the occasional bored academic. The stones lie untouched, shifting slightly under the gentle pull of the Atlantic, wearing away year by year, erasing even the small hints they once offered. Scientists continue to declare the site natural, even as divers continue to swear otherwise. And the sea, of course, says nothing. Because the sea does not care about theories. It only remembers. The Bimini Road teaches this. Sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't the things we can't find. They're the things we find too easily and can't explain without tearing up our neat little maps of the world. Not every wreck comes with bones and sails. Some are wrecks of knowledge itself, drowning not because they were unworthy, but because we refuse to admit we ever knew them. If the Bimini Road hints at a civilization so lost it left no trace but stone, the next wreck shifts from haunting emptiness to haunting familiarity. A city sunk into the ocean not by legend, but by brutal geological catastrophe, dragging its ships, its temples, its people, and its dreams down with it. The Dwarka sunken city wrecks. Most shipwrecks are lonely. A single vessel, broken and bleeding into the dark. But off the coast of Dwarka, India, there isn't just a shipwreck. There's the wreck of an entire city, or the ghost of one drowned so completely that even its gods had to swim for it. A place where legend says the sea came to collect its debts. And archaeology can only shrug and mutter, maybe. The city of Dwarka, ancient, sacred, mythical, is tied to Lord Krishna, one of the most revered deities in Hindu mythology. According to the stories, Krishna built a shining city on the shores of the Arabian Sea, a place of grandeur and miracles. But after his death, the gods, in their infinite pettiness or justice or both, allowed the ocean to rise and swallow it whole. Myth, of course. Just myth. Except, maybe not. In the early 2000s, a team of marine archaeologists surveying the Gulf of Khambhat made an eerie discovery. Using sonar, they mapped structures lying 120 feet below the surface. Long, linear formations. Rectangles and grids too organized for nature's lazy handwriting. Stone anchors, massive and unmistakable. Scattered artifacts, pottery shards, beads, tools. A sunken landscape. A drowned geometry. The early carbon dating on some samples? 9,000 years old. Which would mean these ruins predate every known civilization on Earth by thousands of years. Older than Mesopotamia. Older than Egypt. Older than everything we thought was the beginning. Naturally, no one wanted to believe it. The archaeological community split immediately. Some insisted the structures were natural ancient riverbed formations shaped by geological forces. Others suggested a lost civilization, forgotten by history, perhaps the real foundation for India's flood myths. The Indian government leaned heavily into the idea of rediscovered glory. Western scholars leaned heavily into the idea of coincidence. And meanwhile, the ocean kept pulling the ruins deeper, wave by wave, grain by grain. No ships were found intact at Dwarka. Only fragmentary evidence. Anchors shaped like wheels and triangles, suggesting the existence of docks, ports, fleets. Ships that must have sailed in and out of the ancient city, carrying goods, dreams, prayers. Ships that, when the ocean rose, whether by earthquake, tsunami, climate shift, or some slower, more inevitable betrayal, found themselves sinking alongside temples and palaces, their gods watching helplessly as the tides devoured what human ambition had dared to build. The myth says Krishna knew it was coming. He knew Dwarka would fall. He had built the city not to last forever, but to prove that even gods couldn't outlast time. And so when the waves finally came, the story goes, he walked away without looking back. The ships, the merchants, the warriors, the children, they didn't have the luxury of divine foresight. They drowned. They fled. They left only stone bones behind. Today, the underwater ruins of Dwarka remain controversial. Partly excavated. Partly ignored. Partly whispered about in tourist brochures and nationalist fantasies. Divers report ghostly streets, coral-choked stairways, shattered anchors half buried in silt. And whether they are remnants of Krishna's golden city or merely the flotsam of some other forgotten culture, the feeling remains the same. A loss so old that even its ghosts have forgotten their names. The Dwarka wrecks teach this. Not every sunken thing died of failure. Not every drowning was a defeat. Some were sacrifices. Monuments offered up to the sea because the sea always wins in the end. And if we're lucky, if we're very careful, we find the edges of these sacrifices. The last stone steps leading down into silence. If Dwarka is a city swallowed by the inevitable, the next shipwreck speaks to an even harsher fate. Not a city drowning with dignity, but the broken, battered, confusing remnants of a structure that shouldn't even exist and yet refuses to vanish. The Yonaguni Monument. Some wrecks rot. Some crumble. And some, like the Yonaguni Monument, don't rot or crumble at all. They just sit there, daring you to decide whether you're looking at the bones of a forgotten civilization, or the ocean pulling the world's longest, cruelest prank. In the waters off Yonaguni Island, Japan's southernmost point, there's a place where the seafloor doesn't look like a seafloor. It looks like a city. Or at least, what's left of one. Massive stone structures rise from the depths. Flat terraces. Sharp-edged staircases. Columns, pyramids, and platforms so straight they could slice your fingertips. All lying under about 30 meters of water, wrapped in coral and mystery. Discovered in 1986 by a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake, the Yonaguni formations instantly sparked a battle not between nations, but between two very different armies. Scientists who said, "It's just natural rock formations, calm down." Dreamers who said, "It's the ruins of a lost civilization, maybe Atlantis, maybe Mu, maybe something older, stranger, sadder." And to this day, no one can agree which army is winning. The case for natural formation sounds reasonable. The region is known for earthquake activity fractures, faults, and underwater landslides. Limestone, the primary rock here, fractures naturally into geometric shapes over time. Erosion can sometimes mimic intentional architecture. It's all just geology, they say. Nothing to see here. Move along. But then you dive deeper. Literally. And you start noticing things that geology alone struggles to explain. Massive right angles, consistent across hundreds of meters. Wide, flat roads connecting different terraces. What appear to be steps, precisely carved and evenly spaced. Monolithic pillars rising like broken skyscrapers. Some divers even claim to see carved faces, symbols, walls, gateways, the crumbling fingerprints of builders too ancient for history to remember. If Yonaguni is natural, it's suspiciously good at looking unnatural. If it's artificial, it's the ghost of a world we don't even know how to mourn. The few artifacts recovered nearby stone tools, fossilized remnants, hint at human presence in the area going back as far as 10,000 years. That's long before Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley. It's before civilization was supposed to exist at all. Which means either humans built monumental architecture thousands of years earlier than we ever believed possible, and the ocean ate it before history could take notes. Or we are, once again, seeing castles in the clouds, ruins in the randomness, because we cannot stand the thought that not everything that looks human was made by human hands. Both possibilities are terrible. Both are beautiful. What sank Yonaguni, if it was built at all? Nothing dramatic. No tsunamis, no angry gods, no sudden apocalypse. Just the slow, merciless rise of post-Ice Age seas, creeping inch by inch, year by year, until homes, temples, and dreams were dragged beneath the waves. Not drowned by catastrophe, but erased by patience. The sea doesn't need violence to win. It only needs time. Today, the Yonaguni monument sits there, half mocked, half worshipped, entirely unexplained. Tourists dive among the giant steps and walls, drifting through what might be the ruined plazas of a civilization too stubborn to die cleanly. Scientists write papers arguing over erosion patterns. Mystics write poems about lost worlds swallowed in shame. And the fish, of course, don't care either way. Because the ocean doesn't care whether we recognize its monuments. It only cares that it has them. The Yonaguni monument teaches this. Sometimes, the mystery isn't whether something is natural or artificial. Sometimes, the mystery is why we keep needing it to be one or the other. Why we are so desperate to impose stories on the silence of stone. Why we need ruins even when they never asked to be ruins. And why, no matter how many answers we demand from the sea, it will always respond the same way. A shrug. A whisper. Another tide. The Western Ledge Reef wreck. Some ships sink in war. Some sink in storms. And some, like the wreck at Western Ledge Reef, seem to have sailed straight off the edge of the known world, crashing into rocks their maps never warned them about, in oceans they weren't supposed to understand. A shipwreck from a time when getting lost wasn't an accident. It was an occupational hazard. In the shallow waters off the coast of Bermuda, tangled in the coral teeth of the Western Ledge Reef, lies a wreck whose origins remain murky even today. Discovered in the 1980s, the site yielded the usual suspects: ballast stones, ceramics, iron fastenings, wooden hull remains. But it wasn't just the debris that sparked obsession. It was the timing. The shipwreck is tentatively dated to the very early 1500s, one of the first European voyages across the Atlantic after Columbus opened the floodgates to imperial dreams. Which means it might be, one of the earliest shipwrecks in the New World. And it's sitting in a place no ship should have been yet. Bermuda, in the 16th century, was a ghost island. Uninhabited, untamed, unmapped. Sailors called it the Isle of Devils, cursed with treacherous reefs, howling winds, and storms that shattered ships like toys. No permanent settlements. No safe harbors. Just endless coral ambushes waiting beneath deceptively calm seas. Which raises the question: what was a European ship doing there so early? Was it blown off course by a hurricane? Was it a lost trader, trying to shortcut across uncharted waters? A pirate? A scout? A deserter? Nobody knows. And the ship, as usual, isn't talking. The artifacts suggest a European origin: Spanish or Portuguese ceramics. Metalwork consistent with Iberian shipbuilding practices of the early 1500s. Tools that hint at long-haul voyages, not casual coastal runs. But without inscriptions, flags, or preserved cargo, the identity of the ship and the crew who died with it remains slippery. It could have been a treasure ship. It could have been a desperate colonist. It could have been a pirate trying to carve out a bloody little empire. All we know for sure is that they failed. The Western Ledge Reef claimed them without mercy. The wreck itself lies scattered, shattered by centuries of waves. Keel fragments warped and broken. Iron spikes crusted into anonymity. Ceramic split and ground into coral gravel. It's not a dramatic, cinematic wreck. It's the quiet obliteration of hope. A reminder that most voyages into the unknown end not in glory, but in cold water and broken wood. The Western Ledge Reef wreck teaches this. Discovery is a bloody business. For every Columbus, for every conquistador, for every found land you read about in textbooks, there are 1,000 forgotten sailors. Lost in storms, eaten by reefs, buried without names. History only remembers the winners. The ocean remembers everyone else. Today, Western Ledge Reef is just another dive site. Tourists bob above the wreckage, sipping oxygen through rented regulators, oblivious to the bones and dreams dissolving quietly beneath them. They snap selfies over the ruins. They pose for pictures with the broken dead. And the sea patient infinite waits to add them to the collection someday too. If the Western Ledge Reef wreck is a whisper of how easily ambition can founder in unknown waters, the next wreck shows that even when you know exactly where you're going, even when you plan every step, sometimes the world simply erases you anyway. The Resurgam submarine. Some ships sink because they are cursed. Some because they are careless. And some, like the Resurgam, sink simply because they arrive too early, carrying dreams heavier than their hulls could bear. The Resurgam wasn't a warship or a trading vessel or a merchant's mule. It was a prototype. A prophecy. An iron cylinder built in the late 19th century to prove that humans could finally master the sea, not just on its surface but beneath it. Instead, it sank in a whisper of steam and sorrow. The Resurgam, Latin for "I shall rise again," was the brainchild of Reverend George Garrett, a man who believed, correctly, that the future of warfare would belong to those who could strike from below. His 1,878 design was ambitious. A 45-foot-long steam-powered submarine capable of sneaking under enemy ships, bypassing traditional defenses, and delivering torpedoes where they would do the most damage. It wasn't a military commission. It wasn't backed by a great empire. It was just one man's mad vision, forged in iron and hope. And like most prototypes, it was doomed. The Resurgam was elegant in theory and monstrous in reality. A single steam engine for propulsion. A complicated, hand-cranked rudder system. A carefully balanced hull designed to sink or rise, depending on ballast and temperature. And, naturally, it was riddled with problems. The steam engine produced enormous heat, turning the inside into a humid, barely survivable oven. Ventilation was nearly non-existent. The hull, though revolutionary, wasn't quite strong enough for the pressures it would eventually have to face. Steering was erratic at best, suicidal at worst. Still, it worked at least a little. The Resurgam could dive. It could surface. It could, technically, move underwater. For a few precious moments, it was the future. Then came February 1880. While being towed across rough seas en route to a demonstration for potential buyers, the Resurgam suffered mechanical failure. The tow line snapped. The crew tried to save her. Water flooded in. The iron beast, never designed to survive the chaotic fury of the open sea, slipped quietly beneath the waves off the coast of Rhyl, Wales. No dramatic explosions. No great tragedy. Just a soft, inevitable surrender to the same ocean it had been built to conquer. The crew survived. The dream did not. For decades, the Resurgam was forgotten. Another failed experiment, another footnote in the long, tragic history of human ambition. Until 1995, when divers rediscovered the wreck lying eerily intact on the seabed, entombed in mud and darkness. Even in death, it looked absurdly modern. A steel torpedo lying still, dreaming of a future that had come too late to save it. The Resurgam teaches this. Innovation doesn't guarantee survival. Visionaries don't always live to see their visions succeed. Sometimes you build the future, and the ocean eats it before history even remembers your name. Today, the Resurgam is celebrated as one of the earliest working submarines, an ancestor to the nuclear leviathans that now prowl the deeps. But few remember Reverend Garrett. Fewer still remember the hot, suffocating, impossible dream that propelled him to launch an iron coffin into a future that didn't yet want him. The world eventually caught up. It always does. But by then, Garrett's dream was already rusting in the cold. If the Resurgam sank before it could change the world, the next shipwreck didn't just sink. It shattered an entire expedition, cursed an empire's ambition, and left a frozen trail of madness, mystery, and death across a white, empty hell. The Beechy Island wrecks. Most shipwrecks sink beneath the waves. The wrecks at Beechy Island didn't sink. They simply stopped frozen solid, entombed not by water, but by silence, starvation, and the kind of cold that doesn't kill you quickly enough. This is not the story of a single shipwreck. It's the slow, horrific shipwreck of an entire expedition, one that was supposed to conquer the last blank spaces on the map and instead ended in frozen madness. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set sail from England with two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. tasked with finding the final link of the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific through the Arctic Circle. The ships were marvels of their time. Reinforced with iron plating. Equipped with steam engines. Loaded with enough canned food to last 3 years. Confidence was high. British newspapers sang of glory. Franklin, already an Arctic veteran, was hailed as a hero in waiting. They sailed into the ice and were never seen alive again. Beechy Island, a bleak, wind-scoured rock north of Canada's mainland, became the first whisper of their fate. In 1850, rescuers found evidence there. The graves of 3 crewmen, carefully buried in permafrost. Remnants of a campsite. Cans, boots, broken equipment. The graves were eerily well preserved, the Arctic cold turning bodies into time capsules, faces staring up through frozen earth as if death had barely touched them. The deaths were officially attributed to pneumonia and tuberculosis. But deeper investigations, including modern exhumations, revealed more unsettling details. High levels of lead poisoning, likely from improperly sealed canned food. Signs of malnutrition, scurvy, and bone disease. Possible indications of cannibalism in later stages of the expedition. The dream of the Northwest Passage hadn't just failed. It had rotted from the inside out. The ships themselves drifted farther into the ice. For years, their fates were legend, rumor, campfire ghost stories. Search expeditions scoured the Arctic. None succeeded in time. Eventually, Inuit testimony told of starving white men dragging boats across frozen wastelands, of camps littered with bones, of men losing their minds under the endless Arctic night. In the 21st century, both Erebus and Terror were finally discovered, stunningly well preserved in the frigid waters off King William Island. They rest there still, grim cathedrals of failure, as intact and dead as the men who sailed them. The Franklin expedition is often portrayed as a heroic tragedy, brave explorers bested by an indifferent wilderness. But the deeper you dig, the worse it gets. Shoddy equipment. Inadequate survival training. Arrogance in the face of a land that offered no second chances. They were warned. By other sailors. By the Inuit, whose entire culture revolved around surviving the Arctic. They didn't listen. And the Arctic, polite but firm, made its corrections. Today, Beechy Island is a shrine of sorts. A few lonely graves, battered memorials, and the scattered, pathetic relics of an expedition that mistook maps for understanding and hubris for preparation. Tourists visit now, bundled in Gore-Tex and optimism, standing above graves that have outlived the empire that sent them. And somewhere, deep beneath the ice and black water, the wrecks of Erebus and Terror still lie. Hulls groaning quietly, as the Arctic tides pull them deeper into silence. The Beechy Island wrecks teach this. The wilderness doesn't care about your courage. It doesn't care about your charts, your technology, your national pride. It only cares whether you know how to survive. And if you don't, it will freeze your dreams in place so perfectly that strangers, centuries later, can still smell your failure. If the Franklin expedition was a slow-motion shipwreck in a sea of ice, the next wreck reminds us that sometimes the ocean's cruelty doesn't even wait for exploration. Sometimes it swallows the familiar, the known, the homebound, with the same casual indifference it uses on the proudest ambitions. The Port Royal wrecks. Most shipwrecks are accidents. Bad luck, bad weather, bad judgment. But the wrecks of Port Royal feel like something else entirely. A city swallowed whole in a matter of minutes, as if the ocean itself had finally decided it was tired of waiting for justice. One moment, Port Royal was the richest, wickedest place in the New World. The next, it was gone. And the ships that went down with it still lie there, tangled in the mud, rusting under the weight of an unfinished punishment. Port Royal, Jamaica, in the late 1600s, was the envy and the shame of the Caribbean. A pirate's paradise. A merchant's dream. A priest's nightmare. Drunkenness, gambling, duels in the streets, brothels overflowing with sailors and thieves. Port Royal wore its sins like a crown. It wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. The English crown, desperate for a foothold in the Caribbean, turned a blind eye. Better pirates than Spanish domination. Gold poured in. Ships packed the harbor, stacked high with stolen treasure, slaves, sugar, and rum. Port Royal grew fat, loud, and absurdly rich. It was, in every sense, a shipwreck waiting to happen. On the 7th of June, 1692, the waiting ended. Just before noon, the earth beneath Port Royal began to shake. A monstrous earthquake shattered buildings, split streets apart, and turned solid ground into soup. Liquefaction, a phenomenon where solid earth temporarily behaves like a liquid, caused the city to literally sink. Whole blocks, whole neighborhoods, whole ships gone in seconds. Docks tore away from the shore. Warehouses crumbled into the sea. Mansions and brothels alike slid screaming into the boiling waters. Witnesses said the earth opened and swallowed people alive. Ships that had been moored at the harbor's edge were sucked into the chaos. Capsized, shattered, pulled under by the collapsing town. By the time the shaking stopped, 2/3 of Port Royal had vanished. Thousands dead. Thousands more stranded, broken, diseased. The sea had reclaimed its debt with interest. The shipwrecks of Port Royal tell the story in jagged silence. Ships frozen mid-capsize, lying half-buried in silt. Cargo spilled like guts across the seabed. Cannonballs, rum casks, gold coins. Skeletons pinned beneath collapsed beams still reaching upward. Underwater archaeologists, beginning in the 20th century, found an eerily intact snapshot of 17th century life. Tables still set for meals, walls still hung with paintings, personal effects untouched by time but swallowed by salt. The port wasn't destroyed. It was paused, locked forever in the moment of its judgment. The wrecks are not neat. They aren't heroic. They're desperate, chaotic, horrifying, 1,000 tiny tragedies frozen in the murk. Divers today still report the unnerving feeling of swimming through homes, through streets, through churches, as if the city itself is still dreaming down there, waiting for someone to apologize. Or drown trying. Port Royal today is a ghost. The small modern town that bears the name is a shadow of the sin city it once was. The wrecks lie mostly undisturbed, too fragile and too sacred, even to governments obsessed with tourist dollars. Because you don't build a museum inside a curse. You leave it where it fell. You let the sea keep its trophies. The Port Royal wrecks teach this. Sometimes, the sea doesn't just reclaim land and lives. Sometimes, it reclaims arrogance. Not with rage. Not with drama. Just with one long, tired sigh. And a single, decisive pull downward. If Port Royal was the drowning of human excess, the next wreck teaches something colder still. That even the calmest waters, the most predictable shores, can turn traitor, and that no amount of preparation can save you when the ocean simply decides otherwise. The Pumpuhar Shipwrecks. Some shipwrecks are easy to mourn. Some cities easy to memorialize. But the drowning of Pumpuhar, the ancient Indian port city swallowed whole by the sea, leaves no easy grief behind. No clear battle. No clean disaster. Only the slow, grinding terror of a place that simply forgot to exist. And the wrecks it left behind, barely bones, now whisper a story that doesn't end. It just keeps sinking. Pumpuhar, known anciently as Kavarapatnam, once stood at the mouth of the Kaveri River along India's southeastern coast. According to Tamil literature, it was a city of wonder, a major trading hub connecting India to Rome, China, Southeast Asia. A cultural powerhouse where art, commerce, and religion collided and thrived. A jewel set carefully on the lip of the Bay of Bengal. Merchants, monks, sailors, kings, all moved through its harbors. For centuries, Pumpuhar hummed with the pulse of a world that believed it was eternal. And then the sea came. The ancient Tamil epics hint at a disaster so massive, so total, that the city simply vanished. The sea swallowed the land. The waves destroyed homes and temples. The great harbor was no more. Modern researchers think the stories aren't metaphors. They're memories of a catastrophic event, possibly a tsunami or a slow, relentless rise in sea level, that consumed the city sometime around the 3rd century AD, or maybe even earlier. Pumpuhar didn't burn. It didn't fall to war. It drowned. Not all at once, maybe. Maybe house by house, street by street, year by year, as the sea gnawed at its foundation until the earth gave way and the ocean rolled in like a thief. The evidence today lies offshore. Fragments of submerged wharves and docks. Scattered stone structures, now coral-choked. Ancient pottery shards littering the seabed. In 2001, underwater surveys revealed grid-like patterns beneath the waves. Traces of old streets, foundations, walls. Not a single shipwreck in the traditional sense. But the skeleton of an entire harbor. A drowned metropolis, forgotten by maps, remembered only by the tides. A shipwreck of a city. And here's the cruel poetry. Pumpuhar was built for the sea. Its economy depended on it. Its lifeblood flowed through its docks and markets. Its culture sang praises to the ocean. And yet, in the end, it was the sea that took it. Not in anger, but with the same absent-minded hunger it always brings. What Pumpuhar loved, killed it. What Pumpuhar needed, destroyed it. Today, modern Pumpuhar is little more than a sleepy fishing village. Tourists occasionally wander the beaches, unaware that just offshore, beneath their feet, lie the ruins of a city that once mattered. A city that traded silk and gold. A city that dreamed it was permanent. All it takes is one long, patient wave. All it takes is time. The Pumpuhar wrecks teach this. The sea doesn't need to rage to erase you. It just needs you to forget how close you are to drowning. If Pumpuhar teaches that the ocean is never truly tamed, the next wreck shows that even when humanity believes it's mastering the seas through technology, even when it builds its strongest vessels, it only takes one slip. One moment of carelessness. For the water to remind everyone who's really in charge. The SS Waratah. Some shipwrecks rot where they fell. Some are ripped apart by violence. And some, like the SS Waratah, simply vanish. Swallowed whole by a stretch of sea so empty it seems custom-built for forgetting. No debris. No survivors. No message in a bottle. Only a hole in the world where a ship used to be. Launched in 1908, the Waratah was the pride of the Blue Anchor Line. A luxury passenger steamer. A floating palace designed to ferry the wealthy and their aspirations between England, South Africa, and Australia. Called the Titanic of the Southern Hemisphere before the Titanic even existed. Built to impress and built to endure, the Waratah gleamed with the optimism of a century that believed technology had already conquered nature. It was her second voyage. Her last voyage. In July 1909, the Waratah left Durban, South Africa, bound for Cape Town. She carried about 211 people, passengers, crew, families, hopes. Witnesses aboard another ship, the Clan McIntyre, reported seeing the Waratah sailing smoothly southward, disappearing into the growing mist. It was the last time anyone ever saw her. No distress signals. No debris field. No bodies washed ashore. The Waratah simply failed to arrive. Weeks passed. Searches were launched. Ships combed the waters between Durban and Cape Town. Nothing. It was as if the Southern Ocean had simply plucked her off the surface of the world and filed her away with all the other forgotten things. Theories, naturally, flooded in to fill the silence. Freak wave, a single monstrous wall of water that flipped the Waratah over so quickly, no one had time to react. Structural failure, a design flaw, an unstable center of gravity, a fatal overloading of cargo that made her capsize in rough seas. Sudden storm, a weather event so violent and localized that it obliterated the ship without leaving witnesses. And inevitably, the darker theories. Sabotage. Insurance fraud. Piracy. Ghost stories whispered by lonely sailors. But none of these theories came with evidence. Because the sea, as always, swallowed the receipts. The loss of the Waratah shattered faith in the infallibility of engineering. If a brand new, state-of-the-art steamer could disappear without a trace in an age of telegraphs and radio masts, what chance did anything else have? The Southern Ocean became a graveyard not just for the Waratah's passengers, but for humanity's arrogance. Even today, the wreck has never been definitively found. Search expeditions have combed the seabed, found tantalizing hints, chased ghosts across sonar screens. But the Waratah herself still sleeps somewhere in the cold blackness off the wild coast of South Africa. Waiting. Daring. Drowning. The SS Waratah teaches this. The sea does not owe you closure. It does not care about your technology, your blueprints, your insurance policies. It cares about your weight, your balance, your luck. And when those run out, it erases you so cleanly that even your name sounds like a question. Today, the Waratah is less a shipwreck and more a rumor. A whisper carried by the wind off the cliffs. A chill that rolls up from the surf when the sky turns blacker than it should. If you stand alone on the beaches of the wild coast at night, you might hear it. The sound of a ship that should have arrived 100 years ago, still trying to find its way home. If the SS Waratah was a lesson in disappearance, the next shipwreck shows that sometimes ships don't vanish because they're unlucky or unprepared, but because they're doomed by design, cursed to fail from the moment their keels touch the water. The Batavia wreck. Most shipwrecks are accidents. Wrong storm, wrong reef, wrong moment. But the wreck of the Batavia wasn't just a disaster. It was an audition for hell. A shipwreck so savage, so soaked in betrayal and blood, that even the ocean must have hesitated before swallowing it. The Batavia was launched in 1628, the pride of the Dutch East India Company, VOC. A massive, ornate vessel built to haul spices, silks, silver, and Dutch ambition to the East Indies. Armed to the teeth. Loaded with over 300 people, sailors, soldiers, merchants, families. It was supposed to be the beginning of glory. Instead, it became one of the most horrifying chapters in maritime history. In June 1629, after months at sea, the Batavia struck a reef off the coast of what is now Western Australia. The Houtman Abrolhos Islands, a graveyard of razor-sharp coral and false hope. The ship tore apart almost immediately. No lifeboats. No real rescue plan. Just chaos, screaming, and a desperate scramble onto tiny, barren islands with no fresh water, no food, no shelter. It should have been the end of the story. But it was only the beginning. Among the survivors was Jeremias Cornelis, a senior VOC official and an opportunistic psychopath. Realizing that official rescue was unlikely to come quickly, if at all, Cornelis decided he preferred dictatorship to democracy. He gathered a loyalist group, seized the island's limited resources, and began systematically murdering anyone he considered a threat. Men, women, children. Stabbed, strangled, drowned, abandoned to starve. All under the burning Australian sun, miles from salvation. Cornelis didn't just kill. He planned to build a new empire out of the bones of the wreck, using the survivors or what was left of them as his slaves. Resistance, however, was brewing. A group of soldiers, led by a man named Weeby Hayes, had been marooned on another nearby island initially abandoned by Cornelis to die. But Hayes and his men miraculously found fresh water. They found fish. They survived. When they realized the horrors happening across the water, they armed themselves with makeshift weapons and fought back. The final confrontation was brutal. And by the time an official VOC rescue ship finally arrived months later, the scene they stumbled onto was almost too nightmarish to process. Mass graves. Skeletons twisted in unnatural poses. Survivors so traumatized they could barely speak. A society reduced to murder, cannibalism, and broken oaths. Cornelis and his main conspirators were executed, some on the islands themselves, as a warning carved into the sand. The wreck of the Batavia remained lost for centuries until it was rediscovered in the 20th century. Underwater archaeologists found the shattered remains of the hull, bleached and battered. Cannons. Cargo scattered like broken promises. Artifacts, eerily untouched personal items from people who had hoped for fortunes and found only slaughter. Today, parts of the Batavia are preserved in museums, the iron nails rusting into silence. Tourists gawk at the relics, oblivious that every plank, every coin, every bullet is stained with a history too brutal for polite conversation. The Batavia teaches this. Shipwrecks don't just happen to ships. They happen to people. And when survival is stripped down to its bones, the greatest danger isn't the sea. It's each other. If the Batavia was a shipwreck of human morality, the final wreck in our journey offers a different kind of ending. A ship built to explore, to understand, to open the world wider, that instead disappeared into mist and myth, leaving behind only a question that may never be answered. The HMS Terror. Some shipwrecks break apart. Some burn. And some, like the HMS Terror, don't even have the dignity to die properly. They just drift into the ice, lock themselves in silence, and vanish. Preserved not by accident, but by a coldness so deep it feels personal. The HMS Terror was a ship with a long and brutal resume. Built as a bomb vessel during the War of 1812, meant to lob explosive shells onto enemy towns. Reinforced with solid oak and iron plating, making it almost absurdly tough. Later, repurposed for exploration, a hammerhead driven into the Arctic's frozen heart. In 1845, alongside her sister ship HMS Erebus, Terror sailed with Sir John Franklin's ill-fated expedition to find the last unexplored sections of the Northwest Passage. 2 ships. 129 men. Enough supplies to survive for 3 years. What could go wrong? The answer, of course, was everything. They sailed into Lancaster Sound. They disappeared. For decades, searchers found scraps. Inuit testimonies about starving white men dragging boats over the ice. Abandoned camps. Frozen corpses, faces contorted in the final horror of starvation and madness. The Arctic didn't kill them quickly. It killed them slowly. It killed them thoughtfully. The ships were swallowed whole. For a century and a half, HMS Terror became a ghost story. A cautionary tale for explorers and dreamers. Then, in 2016, it was found, eerily preserved beneath the ice-choked waters of Terror Bay off King William Island. Divers described it like entering a time capsule. Decks intact. Cabins still filled with furniture. Plates still stacked neatly in cupboards. A rowboat bizarrely still tied down, ready to launch into a sea that would never thaw. It was so pristine, it almost looked like the crew might still be inside hiding, waiting, dreaming. Theories still clash about what killed the expedition. Lead poisoning from the canned food, leading to madness and weakness. Scurvy, slowly rotting the men from the inside out. Botulism, a silent killer that rendered food poisonous. Exposure, pure and simple. Endless cold, endless hunger, endless walking until your legs stop moving. Or maybe, just maybe, it was simpler. Arrogance. An empire that thought it could measure and conquer a wilderness that didn't give a damn about maps or titles or manifest destiny. The Arctic doesn't hate you. It just doesn't need you. The HMS Terror lies on the seafloor today, absurdly preserved by the cold that killed it. An entire world, frozen mid-sentence. The captain's cabin possibly containing logbooks that could answer everything. Still locked shut, too delicate to open. Boots by beds. Tables set for meals no one ever finished. A sunken palace of broken dreams, suspended just out of reach. The HMS Terror teaches this. Sometimes you don't need a violent end to be defeated. Sometimes all you need is time. Time and cold and the quiet knowledge that no one is coming to save you. You can be the strongest ship. You can be the bravest men. You can chart every inch of the known world. And you can still be erased, pixel by pixel, breath by frozen breath, until all that's left of you is a half-remembered whisper under the ice.